If you enjoyed my reading of this audiobook and would like to contribute, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/The Expanded Universe Lives Forever. The link is also in the video's description. Star Wars: A New Hope. Formerly titled Star Wars: From the Adventures of Luke Skywalker by George Lucas. Read for you by The Expanded Universe Lives Forever. Introduction. In December 1976, Ballantine Books published a paperback novel called Star Wars: The Adventures of Luke Skywalker. The book was ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster for my screenplay of the film. The cover painting was a piece of early conceptual art by Ralph McQuarrie. In small type on the back cover were the words, "Soon to be a spectacular motion picture from 20th Century Fox." The world's first glimpse of Star Wars happened with little fanfare, and this first edition of the novel sold modestly. It wasn't until the official tie-in version of the book that it sold millions of copies and broke records, much like the film was doing in the theaters. In a way, the original book performed as I had expected the film to do, a respectable showing, certainly nothing to set the world on fire, but hopefully enough to allow me to follow up with further stories of the saga. Happily, Star Wars exceeded my expectations. As the special edition of the original Star Wars novel goes to press, I am once again immersed in writing new episodes of the saga. It fills me with a sense of déjà vu, because the outline for the new trilogy of prequels is actually contained in the first 2 pages of this book, the prologue. I suppose I've come full circle as I return to the beginning and start again. Prologue. Another galaxy, another time. The Old Republic was a republic of legend, greater than distance or time. No need to note where it was or whence it came, only to know that it was the Republic. Once, under the wise rule of the Senate and the protection of the Jedi Knights, the Republic thrived and grew. But as often happens when wealth and power pass beyond the admirable and obtain the awesome, then appear those evil ones who have greed to match. So it was with the Republic at its height. Like the greatest of trees, able to withstand any external attack, the Republic rotted from within, though the danger was not visible from outside. Aided and abetted by restless, power-hungry individuals within the government and the massive organs of commerce, the ambitious Senator Palpatine caused himself to be elected President of the Republic. He promised to reunite the disaffected among the people and to restore the remembered glory of the Republic. Once secure in office, he declared himself emperor, shutting himself away from the populace. Soon he was controlled by the very assistants and bootlickers he had appointed to high office, and the cries of the people for justice did not reach his ears. Having exterminated through treachery and deception the Jedi Knights, guardians of justice in the galaxy, the imperial governors and bureaucrats prepared to institute a reign of terror among the disheartened worlds of the galaxy. Many used the imperial forces and the name of the increasingly isolated emperor to further their own personal ambitions. But a small number of systems rebelled at these new outrages. Declaring themselves opposed to the new order, they began the great battle to restore the old republic. From the beginning, they were vastly outnumbered by the systems held in thrall by the emperor. In those first dark days, it seemed certain the bright flame of resistance would be extinguished before it could cast the light of new truth across the galaxy of oppressed and beaten peoples. From the First Saga, Journal of the Wills. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naturally, they became heroes. Leia Organa of Alderaan, Senator. 1. It was a vast, shining globe, and it cast a light of lambent topaz into space. But it was not a sun. Thus, the planet had fooled men for a long time. Not until entering close orbit around it did its discoverers realize that this was a world in a binary system, and not a third sun itself. At first, it seemed certain nothing could exist on such a planet, least of all humans. Yet both massive G1 and G2 stars orbited a common center with peculiar regularity, and Tatooine circled them far enough out to permit the development of a rather stable, if exquisitely hot, climate. Mostly this was a dry desert of a world, whose unusual star-like yellow glow was the result of double sunlight striking sodium-rich sands and flats. That same sunlight suddenly shone on the thin skin of a metallic shape falling crazily toward the atmosphere. The erratic course the galactic cruiser was traveling was intentional, not the product of injury, but of a desperate desire to avoid it. Long streaks of intense energy slid close past its hull, a multi-hued storm of destruction like a school of rainbow remoras fighting to attach themselves to a larger unwilling host. One of those probing, questing beams succeeded in touching the fleeing ship, striking its principal solar fin. Gem-like fragments of metal and plastic erupted into space as the end of the fin disintegrated. The vessel seemed to shudder. The source of those multiple energy beams suddenly hove into view, a lumbering imperial cruiser, its massive outline bristling cactus-like with dozens of heavy weapons emplacements. Light ceased arching from those spines, now as the cruiser moved in close. Intermittent explosions and flashes of light could be seen in those portions of the smaller ship which had taken hits. In the absolute cold of space, the cruiser snuggled up alongside its wounded prey. Another distant explosion shook the ship, but it certainly didn't feel distant to R2-D2 or C-3PO. The concussion bounced them around the narrow corridor like bearings in an old motor. To look at these two, one would suppose that the tall, human-like machine, 3PO, was the master, and the stubby, tripodal robot, R2-D2, an inferior. But while 3PO might have sniffed disdainfully at this suggestion, they were in fact equal in everything save loquacity. Here 3PO was clearly, and necessarily, the superior. Still another explosion rattled the corridor, throwing 3PO off balance. His shorter companion had the better of it during such moments with a squat cylindrical body's lower center of gravity well balanced on thick clawed legs. R2 glanced up at 3PO, who was steadying himself against the corridor wall. Lights blinked enigmatically around a single mechanical eye as the smaller robot studied the battered casing of his friend. A patina of metal and fibrous dust coated the usually gleaming bronze finish, and there were some visible dents. All the result of the pounding the rebel ship they were on had been taking. Accompanying the last attack was a persistent deep hum, which even the loudest explosion had not been able to drown out. Then, for no apparent reason, the basso thrumming abruptly ceased, and the only sounds in the otherwise deserted corridor came from the eerie, dry twig crackle of shorting relays or the pops of dying circuitry. Explosions began to echo through the ship once more, but they were far away from the corridor. 3PO turned his smooth, human-like head to one side. Metallic ears listened intently. The imitation of a human pose was hardly necessary. 3PO's auditory sensors were fully omnidimensional, but the slim robot had been programmed to blend perfectly among human company. This programming extended even to mimicry of human gestures. "Did you hear that?" he inquired rhetorically of his patient companion, referring to the throbbing sound. "They've shut down the main reactor in the drive." His voice was as full of disbelief and concern as that of any human. One metallic palm rubbed dolefully at a patch of dull gray on his side, where a broken hull brace had fallen and scored the bronze finish. 3PO was a fastidious machine, and such things troubled him. "Madness! This is madness!" He shook his head slowly. "This time we'll be destroyed for sure." R2 did not comment immediately. Barrel torso tilted backward, powerful legs gripping the deck, the meter-high robot was engrossed in studying the roof overhead. Though he did not have a head to cock in a listening posture like his friend, R2 still somehow managed to convey that impression. A series of short beeps and chirps issued from his speaker. To even a sensitive human ear they would have been just so much static, but to 3PO they formed words as clear and pure as direct current. "Yes, I suppose they did have to shut the drive down," 3PO admitted. "But what are we going to do now? We can't enter atmosphere with our main stabilizer fin destroyed. I can't believe we're simply going to surrender." A small band of armed humans suddenly appeared, rifles held at the ready. Their expressions were as worry-wrinkled as their uniforms, and they carried about them the aura of men prepared to die. 3PO watched silently until they had vanished around a far bend in the passageway, then looked back at R2. The smaller robot hadn't shifted from his position of listening. 3PO's gaze turned upward also, though he knew R2's senses were slightly sharper than his own. "What is it, R2?" A short burst of beeping came in response. Another moment, and there was no need for highly attuned sensors. For a minute or two more, the corridor remained deathly silent. Then a faint scrape, scrape could be heard, like a cat at a door, from somewhere above. That strange noise was produced by heavy footsteps and the movement of bulky equipment somewhere on the ship's hull. When several muffled explosions sounded, 3PO murmured, "They've broken in somewhere above us. There's no escape for the captain this time." Turning, he peered down at R2. "I think we'd better—" The shriek of overstressed metal filled the air before he could finish, and the far end of the passageway was lit by a blinding, actinic flash. Somewhere down there, the little cluster of armed crew who had passed by minutes before had encountered the ship's attackers. 3PO turned his face and delicate photoreceptors away, just in time to avoid the fragments of metal that flew down the corridor. At the far end, a gaping hole appeared in the roof, and reflective forms like big metal beads began dropping to the corridor floor. Both robots knew that no machine could match the fluidity with which those shapes moved and instantly assumed fighting postures. The new arrivals were humans in armor, not mechanicals. One of them looked straight at 3PO. No, not at him, the panicked robot thought frantically, but past him. The figure shifted its big rifle around its armored hands. Too late. A beam of intense light struck the head, sending pieces of armor, bone, and flesh flying in all directions. Half the invading Imperial troops turned and began returning fire up the corridor, aiming past the two robots. "Quick! This way!" 3PO ordered, intending to retreat from the Imperials. R2 turned with him. They had taken only a couple of steps when they saw the rebel crewmen in position ahead, firing down the corridor. In seconds, the passageway was filled with smoke and crisscrossing beams of energy. Red, green, and blue bolts ricocheted off polished sections of wall and floor, or ripped long gashes in metal surfaces. Screams of injured and dying humans, a peculiarly unrobotic sound, 3PO thought, echoed piercingly above the inorganic destruction. One beam struck near the robot's feet at the same time as the second one burst the wall directly behind him, exposing sparking circuitry and rows of conduits. The force of the twin blast tumbled 3PO into the shredded cables, where a dozen different currents turned him into a jerking, twisting display. Strange sensations coursed through his metal nerve ends. They caused no pain, only confusion. Every time he moved and tried to free himself, there was another violent crackling, as a fresh cluster of componentry broke. The noise and man-made lightning remained constant around him as the battle continued to rage. Smoke began to fill the corridor. R2-D2 bustled about trying to help free his friend. The little robot evidenced a phlegmatic indifference to the ravening energies filling the passageway. He was built so low that most of the beams passed over him anyway. "Help!" 3PO yelled, suddenly frightened at a new message from an internal sensor. "I think something is melting. Free my left leg. The trouble's near the pelvic servo motor." Typically, his tone turned abruptly from pleading to berating. "This is all your fault," he shouted angrily. "I should have known better than to trust the logic of a half-size thermocapsularly dehousing assister. I don't know why you insisted we leave our assigned stations to come down this stupid access corridor. Not that it matters now. This whole ship must be—" R2-D2 cut him off in mid-speech with some angry beepings and hoots of his own, though he continued to cut and pull with precision at the tangled high-voltage cables. "Is that so?" 3PO sneered in reply. "The same to you, you little—" An exceptionally violent explosion shook the passage, drowning them out. A lung-searing miasma of carbonized component filled the air, obscuring everything. 2 meters tall, bipedal, flowing black robes trailing from the figure, and a face forever masked by a functional, if bizarre, black metal breath screen. A dark Lord of the Sith was an awesome, threatening shape, as it strode through the corridors of the rebel ship. Fear followed the footsteps of all the Dark Lords. The cloud of evil which clung tight about this particular one was intense enough to cause hardened Imperial troops to back away, menacing enough to set them muttering nervously among themselves. Once resolute rebel crew members ceased resisting, broke and ran in panic at the sight of the black armor which, though black as it was not nearly as dark as the thoughts drifting through the mind within. One purpose, one thought, one obsession dominated that mind now. It burned in the brain of Darth Vader as he turned down another passageway in the broken fighter. There smoke was beginning to clear, though the sounds of faraway fighting still resounded through the hull. The battle here had ended and moved on. Only a robot was left to stir feebly in the wake of the Dark Lord's passing. C-3PO finally stepped clear of the last restraining cable. Somewhere behind him, human screams could be heard from where relentless Imperial troops were mopping up the last remnants of rebel resistance. 3PO glanced down and saw only scarred deck. As he looked around, his voice was full of concern. R2-D2, where are you? The smoke seemed to part just a bit more. 3PO found himself staring up the passageway. R2-D2, it seemed, was there. But he wasn't looking in 3PO's direction. Instead, the little robot appeared frozen in an attitude of attention. Leaning over him it was difficult for even 3PO's electronic photoreceptors to penetrate the clinging, acidic smoke. A human figure. It was young, slim, and by obtruse human standards of aesthetics, 3PO mused, of a calm beauty. One small hand seemed to be moving over the front of R2's torso. 3PO started toward them as the haze thickened once more. But when he reached the end of the corridor, only R2 stood there, waiting. 3PO peered past him, uncertain. Robots were occasionally subject to electronic hallucinations. But why should he hallucinate a human? He shrugged. Then again, why not? Especially when one considered the confusing circumstances of the past hour and the dose of raw current he had recently absorbed. He shouldn't be surprised at anything his concatenated internal circuits conjured up. "Where have you been?" 3PO finally asked. "Hiding, I suppose." He decided not to mention the maybe human. If it had been a hallucination, he wasn't going to give R2 the satisfaction of knowing how badly recent events had unsettled his logic circuits. "They'll be coming back this way," he went on, nodding down the corridor and not giving the small automaton a chance to reply. "Looking for human survivors. What are we going to do now? They won't trust the word of rebel-owned machines that we don't know anything of value. We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel, or taken apart for spare components for other less deserving droids. That's if they don't consider us potential program traps and blow us apart on sight. If we don't—" But R2 had already turned and was ambling quickly back down the passageway. "Wait, where are you going? Haven't you been listening to me?" Uttering curses in several languages, some purely mechanical, 3PO raced fluidly after his friend. The R2 unit, he thought to himself, could be downright close-circuited when it wanted to. Outside the Galactic Cruiser's control center, the corridor was crowded with sullen prisoners gathered by Imperial troops. Some lay wounded, some dying. Several officers had been separated from the enlisted ranks and stood in a small group by themselves, bestowing belligerent looks and threats on the silent knot of troops holding them at bay. As if on command, everyone, Imperial troops as well as rebels, became silent as a massive caped form came into view from behind a turn in the passage. Two of the heretofore resolute, obstinate rebel officers began to shake. Stopping before one of the men, the towering figure reached out wordlessly. A massive hand closed around the man's neck and lifted him off the deck. The rebel officer's eyes bulged, but he kept his silence. An Imperial officer, his armored helmet shoved back to reveal a recent scar where an energy beam had penetrated his shielding, scrambled down out of the fighter's control room, shaking his head briskly. "Nothing, sir. Information retrieval system's been wiped clean." Darth Vader acknowledged this news with a barely perceptible nod. The impenetrable mask turned to regard the officer he was torturing. Metal-clad fingers contracted. Reaching up, the prisoner desperately tried to pry them loose, but to no avail. "Where is the data you intercepted?" Vader rumbled dangerously. "What have you done with the information tapes?" "We intercepted no information," the dangling officer gurgled, barely able to breathe. From somewhere deep within he dredged up a squeal of outrage. "This is a counselor vessel. Did you not see our exterior markings? We're on a diplomatic mission." "Chaos take your mission," Vader growled. "Where are those tapes?" He squeezed harder, the threat in his grip implicit. When he finally replied, the officer's voice was a barely choked whisper. "Only the commander knows." "This ship carries the system crest of Alderaan," Vader growled, the gargoyle-like breath mask leaning close. "Is any of the royal family on board? Who are you carrying?" Thick fingers tightened further, and the officer's struggles became more and more frantic. His last words were muffled and choked past intelligibility. Vader was not pleased. Even though the figure went limp with an awful, unquestionable finality, that hand continued to tighten, producing a chilling snapping and popping of bone, like a dog paddling on plastic. Then, with a disgusted wheeze, Vader finally threw the doll form of the dead man against the far wall. Several Imperial troops ducked out of the way just in time to avoid the grisly missile. The massive form whirled unexpectedly, and Imperial officers shrank under their baleful, sculptured stare. Start tearing this ship apart piece by piece, component by component, until you find those tapes. As for the passengers, if any, I want them alive. He paused a moment, then added, quickly. Officers and men nearly fell over themselves in their haste to leave, not necessarily to carry out Vader's orders, but simply to retreat from that malevolent presence. R2-D2 finally came to a halt in an empty corridor devoid of smoke and the signs of battle. A worried, confused 3PO pulled up behind him. You've led us through half the ship, into what? He broke off, staring in disbelief as the squat robot reached up with one clawed limb and snapped the seal of a lifeboat hatch. Immediately, a red warning light came on and a low hooting sounded in the corridor. 3PO looked wildly in all directions, but the passageway remained empty. When he looked back, R2 was already working his way into the cramped boat pod. It was just large enough to hold several humans, and its design was not laid out to accompany mechanicals. R2 had some trouble negotiating the awkward little compartment. Hey! A startled 3PO called, admonishing. You're not permitted in there. It's restricted to humans only. We just might be able to convince the Imperials that we're not rebel programmed and you are too valuable to break up, but if someone sees you in there, we haven't got a chance. Come on out. Somehow, R2 had succeeded in wedging his body into position in front of the miniature control board. He cocked his body slightly and threw a stream of loud beeps and whistles at his reluctant companion. 3PO listened. He couldn't frown, but he managed to give a good impression of doing so. Mission? What mission? What are you talking about? You sound like you haven't got an integrated logic terminal left in your brain. No, no more adventures. I'll take my chances with the Imperials, and I'm not getting in there. An angry electronic twang came from the R2 unit. Don't call me a mindless philosopher, 3PO snapped back, you overweight, unstreamlined glob of grease. 3PO was concocting an additional rejoinder when an explosion blew out the back wall of the corridor. Dust and metal debris whooshed through the narrow sub-passageway, followed instantly by a series of secondary explosions. Flames began jumping hungrily from the exposed interior wall, reflecting off 3PO's isolated patches of polished skin. Muttering the electronic equivalent of consigning his soul to the unknown, the lanky robot jumped into the life pod. I'm going to regret this, he muttered more audibly as R2 activated the safety door behind him. The smaller robot flipped a series of switches, snapped back a cover, and pressed 3 buttons in a certain sequence. With the thunder of explosive latches, the life pod ejected from the crippled fighter. When word came over the communicators that the last pod of resistance on the rebel ship had been cleaned out, the captain of the Imperial cruiser relaxed considerably. He was listening with pleasure to proceedings on the captured vessel when one of the chief gunnery officers called to him. Moving to the man's position, the captain stared into the circular view screen and saw a tiny dot dropping away toward the fiery world below. There goes another pod, sir. Instructions? The officer's hand hovered over a computerized energy battery. Casually, confident in the firepower and total control under his command, the captain studied the nearby readouts monitoring the pod. All of them read blank. Hold your fire, Lieutenant Hija. Instruments show no life forms aboard. The pod's release mechanism must have short-circuited or received a false instruction. Don't waste your power. He turned away to listen with satisfaction to the reports of captured men and material coming from the rebel ship. Glare from exploding panels and erupting circuitry reflected crazily off the armor of the lead stormtrooper as he surveyed the passageway ahead. He was about to turn and call for those behind to follow him forward when he noticed something moving off to one side. It appeared to be crouching back in a small, dark alcove. Holding his pistol ready, he moved cautiously forward and peered into the recess. A small, shivering figure clad in flowing white hugged the back of the recess and stared up at the man. Now he could see that he faced a young woman, and her physical description fit that of the one individual the Dark Lord was most interested in. The trooper grinned behind his helmet. A lucky encounter for him. He would be commended. Within the armor, his head turned slightly, directing his voice to the tiny condenser microphone. "Here she is," he called to those behind him. "Set for stunt force." He never finished the sentence, just as he would never receive the hoped-for commendation. Once his attention turned from the girl to his communicator, her shivering vanished with startling speed. The energy pistol she had held out of sight behind her came up and around as she burst from her hiding place. The trooper who had been unlucky enough to find her fell first, his head a mass of melted bone and metal. The same fate met the second armored form coming up fast behind him. Then a bright green energy pole touched the woman's side, and she slumped instantly to the deck, the pistol still locked in her small palm. Metal-encased shapes clustered around her. One whose arm bore the insignia of a lower officer knelt and turned her over. He studied the paralyzed form with a practiced eye. "She'll be all right," he finally declared, looking up at his subordinates. "Report to Lord Vader." 3PO stared, mesmerized, out the small viewport set in the front of the tiny escape pod as the hot yellow eye of Tatooine began to swallow them up. Somewhere behind them, he knew, the crippled fighter and the Imperial cruiser were receding to imperceptibility. That was fine with him. If they landed near a civilized city, he would seek elegant employment in a halcyon atmosphere, something more befitting his status and training. These past months had gifted him with entirely too much excitement and unpredictability for a mere machine. R2's seemingly random manipulation of the pod controls promised anything but a smooth landing, however. 3PO regarded his squat companion with concern. "Are you sure you know how to pilot this thing?" R2 replied with a non-committal whistle that did nothing to alter the taller robot's jangled state of mind. 2. It was an old settler saying that you could burn your eyes out faster by staring straight and hard at the sun-scorched flatlands of Tatooine than by looking directly at its two huge suns themselves. So powerful was the penetrating glare reflected from those endless wastes. Despite the glare, life could and did exist in the flatlands formed by long evaporated seabeds. One thing made it possible, the reintroduction of water. For human purposes, however, the water of Tatooine was only marginally accessible. The atmosphere yielded its moisture with reluctance. It had to be coaxed down out of the hard blue sky, coaxed, forced, yanked down to the parched surface. Two figures whose concern was obtaining that moisture were standing on a slight rise of one of those inhospitable flats. One of the pair was stiff and metallic, a sand-pitted evaporator sunk securely through sand and into deeper rock. The figure next to it was a good deal more animated, though no less sun-weathered. Luke Skywalker was twice the age of the 10-year-old evaporator, but much less secure. At the moment, he was swearing softly at a recalcitrant valve adjuster on the temperamental device. From time to time he resorted to some unsubtle pounding in place of using the appropriate tool. Neither method worked very well. Luke was sure that the lubricants used on the evaporators went out of their way to attract sand, beckoning seductively to small abrasive particles with an oily gleam. He wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned back for a moment. The most prepossessing thing about the young man was his name. A light breeze tugged at his shaggy hair and baggy work tunic as he regarded the device. No point in staying angry at it, he counseled himself. It's only an unintelligent machine. As Luke considered his predicament, a third figure appeared, scooting out from behind the evaporator to fumble awkwardly at the damaged section. Only 3 of the Treadwell model robot's 6 arms were functioning, and these had seen more wear than the boots on Luke's feet. The machine moved with unsteady stop-and-start motions. Luke gazed at it sadly, then inclined his head to study the sky. Still no sign of a cloud, and he knew there never would be unless he got that evaporator working. He was about to try once again when a small, intense gleam of light caught his eye. Quickly he slipped the carefully cleaned set of macro binoculars from his utility belt and focused the lens skyward. For long moments he stared, wishing all the while that he had a real telescope instead of the binocs. As he stared, evaporators, the heat, and the day's remaining chores were forgotten. Clipping the binoculars back onto his belt, Luke turned and dashed for the land speeder. Halfway to the vehicle, he thought to call behind him. "Hurry up!" he shouted impatiently. "What are you waiting for? Get it in gear!" The Treadwell started toward him, hesitated, and then commenced spinning in a tight circle, smoke belching from every joint. Luke shouted further instructions, then finally gave up in disgust when he realized that it would take more than words to motivate the Treadwell again. For a moment, Luke hesitated at leaving the machine behind. But, he argued to himself, its vital components were obviously shot. So he jumped into the land speeder, causing the recently repaired repulsion floater to list alarmingly to one side until he was able to equalize weight distribution by sliding behind the controls. Maintaining its altitude slightly above the sandy ground, the light-duty transport vehicle steadied itself like a boat in a heavy sea. Luke gunned the engine, which whined in protest, and sand erupted behind the floater as he aimed the craft toward the distant town of Anchorhead. Behind him, a pitiful beacon of black smoke from the burning robot continued to rise into the clear desert air. It wouldn't be there when Luke returned. There were scavengers of metal as well as flesh in the wide wastes of Tatooine. Metal and stone structures bleached white by the glaze of twin Tattoo 1 and 2 huddled together tightly, for company as much as for protection. They formed the nexus of the widespread farming community of Anchorhead. Presently the dusty, unpaved streets were quiet, deserted. Sandflies buzzed lazily in the cracked eaves of poor stone buildings. A dog barked in the distance, the sole sign of habitation until a lone old woman appeared and started across the street. Her metallic sun shawl was pulled tightly around her. Something made her look up, tired eyes squinting into the distance. The sound suddenly leaped in volume as a shining rectangular shape came roaring around a corner. Her eyes popped as the vehicle bore down on her, showing no sign of altering its path. She had to scramble to get out of its way. Panting and waving an angry fist after the land speeder, she raised her voice over the sound of its passage. "Won't you kids ever learn to slow down?" Luke might have seen her, but he certainly didn't hear her. In both cases, his attention was focused elsewhere as he pulled up behind a low, long, concrete station. Various coils and rods jutted from its top and sides. Tatooine's relentless sand waves broke in frozen yellow spume against the station's walls. No one had bothered to clear them away. There was no point. They would only return again the following day. Luke slammed the front door aside and shouted, "Hey!" A rugged young man in mechanic's dress sat sprawled in a chair behind the station's unkept control desk. Sunscreen oil had kept his skin from burning. The skin of the girl on his lap had been equally protected, and there was a great deal more of the protected area in view. Somehow, even dried sweat looked good on her. "Hey, everybody!" Luke yelled again, having elicited something less than an overwhelming response with his first cry. He ran toward the instrument room at the rear of the station, while the mechanic, half asleep, ran a hand across his face and mumbled, "Did I hear a young noise blast through here?" The girl on his lap stretched sinuously, her well-worn clothing tugging in various intriguing directions. Her voice was casually throaty. "Oh," she yawned, "that was just Wormy on one of his rampages." Deke and Wendy looked up from the computer-assisted pool game as Luke burst into the room. They were dressed much like Luke, although their clothing was of better fit and somewhat less exercised. All three youths contrast strikingly with the burly, handsome player at the far side of the table. From neatly clipped hair to his precision-cut uniform, he stood out in the room like an oriental poppy in a sea of oats. Behind the three humans, a small hum came from where a repair robot was working patiently on a broken piece of station equipment. "Shape it up, you guys!" Luke yelled excitedly. Then he noticed the older man in the uniform. The subject of his suddenly startled gaze recognized him simultaneously. "Biggs!" The man's face twisted in a half-grin. "Hello, Luke." Then they were embracing each other warmly. Luke finally stood away, openly admiring the other's uniform. "I didn't know you were back. When did you get in?" The confidence in the other's voice bordered the realm of smugness without quite entering it. "Just a little while ago. I wanted to surprise you, hotshot." He indicated the room. "I thought you'd be here with these other two night crawlers." Deke and Wendy both smiled. "I certainly didn't expect you to be out working." He laughed easily, a laugh few people found resistible. "The academy didn't change you much," Luke commented. "But you're back so soon." His expression grew concerned. "Hey, what happened? Didn't you get your commission?" There was something evasive about Biggs as he replied, looking slightly away. "Of course I got it. Signed to serve aboard the freighter Ran to Click just last week. First mate Biggs Darklighter at your service." He performed a twisting salute, half serious and half humorous, then grinned that overbearing yet ingratiating grin again. "I just came back to say goodbye to all you unfortunate landlocked simpletons." They all laughed, until Luke suddenly remembered what had brought him here in such a hurry. "I almost forgot," he told them, his initial excitement returning. "There's a battle going on right here in our system. Come and look." Deke looked disappointed. "Not another one of your epic battles, Luke. Haven't you dreamed up enough of them? Forget it." Forget it. Hell, I'm serious. It's a battle, all right. With words and shoves, he managed to cajole the occupants of the station out into the strong sunlight. Cammy, in particular, looked disgusted. This had better be worth it, Luke, she warned him, shading her eyes against the glare. Luke already had his macro binoculars out and was searching the heavens. It took only a moment for him to fix on a particular spot. I told you, he insisted. There they are. Biggs moved alongside him and reached for the binoculars as the other strained unaided eyes. A slight adjustment provided just enough magnification for Biggs to make out two silvery specks against the dark blue. That's no battle, hotshot, he decided, lowering the binocs and regarding his friend gently. They're just sitting there. Two ships, all right. Probably a barge loading a freighter, since Tatooine hasn't got an orbital station. There was a lot of firing earlier, Luke added. His initial enthusiasm was beginning to falter under the withering assurance of his older friend. Cammy grabbed the binoculars away from Biggs, banging them slightly against a support pillar in the process. Luke took them away from her quickly, inspecting the casing for damage. Take it easy with those. Don't worry so much, Wormy, she sneered. Luke took a step toward her, then halted as the huskier mechanic easily interposed himself between them and favored Luke with a warning smile. Luke considered, shrugging the incident away. I keep telling you, Luke, the mechanic said, with the air of a man tired of repeating the same story to no avail. The rebellion is a long way from here. I doubt if the Empire would fight to keep this system. Believe me, Tatooine's a big hunk of nothing. His audience began to fade back into the station before Luke could mutter a reply. Fixer had his arm around Cammy, and the two of them were chuckling over Luke's ineptitude. Even Deke and Windy were murmuring among themselves. About him, Luke was certain. He followed them, but not without a last glance back and up to the distant specks. One thing he was sure of were the flashes of light he had seen between the two ships. They hadn't been caused by the suns of Tatooine reflecting off metal. The binding that locked the girl's hands behind her back was primitive and effective. The constant attention the squad of heavily armed troopers favored her with might have been out of place for one small female, except for the fact that their lives depended on her being delivered safely. When she deliberately slowed her pace, however, it became apparent that her captors did not mind mistreating her a little. One of the armored figures shoved her brutally in the small of the back, and she nearly fell. Turning, she gave the offending soldier a vicious look. But she could not tell if it had any effect, since the man's face was completely hidden by his armored helmet. The hallway they eventually emerged into was still smoking around the edges of the smoldering cavity blasted through the hull of the fighter. A portable accessway had been sealed to it, and a circlet of light showed at the far end of the tunnel, bridging space between the rebel craft and the cruiser. A shadow moved over her as she turned from inspecting the accessway, startling her despite her usually unshakable self-control. Above her towered the threatening bulk of Darth Vader, red eyes glaring behind the hideous breath mask. A muscle twitched in one smooth cheek, but other than that the girl didn't react. Nor was there the slightest shake in her voice. Darth Vader, I should have known. Only you would be so bold. And so stupid. Well, the Imperial Senate will not sit still for this, when they hear you've attacked a diplomatic Senator Leia Organa, Vader rumbled softly, though strongly enough to override her protests. His pleasure at finding her was evident in the way he savored every syllable. Don't play games with me, Your Highness, he continued ominously. You aren't on any mercy mission this time. You passed directly through a restricted system, ignoring numerous warnings and completely disregarding orders to turn about, until it no longer mattered. The huge metal skull dipped close. I know that several transmissions were beamed to this vessel by spies within that system. When we traced those transmissions back to the individuals with whom they originated, they had the poor grace to kill themselves before they could be questioned. I want to know what happened to the data they sent you. Neither Vader's words nor his inimical presence appeared to have any effect on the girl. I don't know what you're blathering about, she snapped, looking away from him. I'm a member of the Senate on a diplomatic mission to your part of the Rebel Alliance, Vader declared, cutting her off accusingly. You're also a traitor. His gaze went to a nearby officer. Take her away. She succeeded in reaching him with her spit, which hissed against still-hot battle armor. He wiped the offensive matter away silently, watching her with interest as she was marched through the accessway into the cruiser. A tall, slim soldier wearing the sign of an Imperial commander attracted Vader's attention as he came up next to him. "Holding her is dangerous," he ventured, likewise looking after her as she was escorted toward the cruiser. "If word of this got out, there will be much unrest in the Senate. It will generate sympathy for the rebels." The commander looked up at the unreadable metal face, then added in an offhanded manner, "She should be destroyed immediately." "No. My first duty is to locate that hidden fortress of theirs," Vader replied easily. "All the rebel spies have been eliminated, by our hand or their own. Therefore, she is now my only key to discovering its location. I intend to make full use of her. If necessary, I will use her up, but I will learn the location of the rebel base." The commander pursed his lips, shook his head slightly, perhaps a bit sympathetically, as he considered the woman. "She'll die before she gives you any information." Vader's reply was chilling in its indifference. "Leave that to me." He considered a moment, then went on. "Send out a wide-band distress signal. Indicate that the Senator's ship encountered an unexpected meteorite cluster it could not avoid. Readings indicate that the shift shields were overridden and the ship was hulled to the point of vacating 95% of its atmosphere. Inform her father and the Senate that all aboard were killed." A cluster of tired-looking troops marched purposely up to their commander and the Dark Lord. Vader eyed them expectantly. "The data tapes in question are not aboard the ship. There is no valuable information in the ship's storage banks and no evidence of bank erasure," the officer in charge recited mechanically. "Nor were any transmissions directed outward from the ship from the time we made contact. A malfunctioning lifeboat pod was ejected during the fighting, but it was confirmed at the time that no life forms were on board." Vader appeared thoughtful. "It could have been a malfunctioning pod," he mused. "That might also have contained the tapes. Tapes are not life forms. In all probability, any native finding them would be ignorant of their importance, and would likely clear them for their own use. Still—" "Send down a detachment to retrieve them, or to make certain they are not in the pod," he finally ordered the commander and attentive officer. "Be as subtle as possible. There is no need to attract attention, even on this miserable outpost world." As the officer and troops departed, Vader turned his gaze back to the commander. "Vaporize this fighter. We don't want to leave anything. As for the pod, I cannot take the chance it was a simple malfunction. The data it might contain could prove too damaging. See to this personally, Commander. If those data tapes exist, they must be retrieved or destroyed at all costs." Then he added with satisfaction, "With that accomplished, and the Senator in our hands, we will see the end of this absurd rebellion." "It shall be as you direct, Lord Vader," the commander acknowledged. Both men entered the accessway to the cruiser. "What a forsaken place this is!" 3PO turned cautiously to look back at where the pod lay half buried in sand. His internal gyros were still unsteady from the rough landing. Landing. The mere application of the term unduly flattered his dull associate. On the other hand, he supposed he ought to be grateful they had come down in one piece. Although, he mused, as he studied the barren landscape, he still wasn't sure they were better off here than they would have been had they remained on the captured cruiser. High sandstone mesas dominated the sight line to one side. Every other direction showed only endless stories of marching dunes like long yellow teeth stretching for kilometer on kilometer into the distance. Sand ocean blended in sky glare until it was impossible to distinguish where one ended and the other began. A faint cloud of minute dust particles rose in their wake as the two robots marched away from the pod. That vehicle, its intended function fully discharged, was now quite useless. Neither robot had been designed for pedal locomotion on this kind of terrain, so they had to fight their way across the unstable surface. "We seem to have been made to suffer," 3PO moaned in self-pity. "It's a rotten existence." Something squeaked in his right leg, and he winced. "I've got to rest before I fall apart. My internals still haven't recovered from that headlong crash you called a landing." He paused, but R2-D2 did not. The little automaton had performed a sharp turn and was now ambling slowly but steadily in the direction of the nearest outjut of mesa. "Hey!" 3PO yelled. R2 ignored the call and continued striding. "Where do you think you're going?" Now R2 paused, emitting a stream of electronic explanation as 3PO exhaustedly walked over to join him. Well, I'm not going that way, 3PO declared when R2 had concluded his explanation. It's too rocky. He gestured in the direction they had been walking, at an angle away from the cliffs. This way is much easier. A metal hand waved disparagingly at the high mesas. What makes you think there are any settlements that way, anyhow? A long whistle issued from the depths of R2. Don't get technical with me, 3PO warned. I've had just about enough of your decisions. R2 beeped once. All right, go your way, 3PO announced grandly. You'll be sandlogged within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile. He gave the R2 unit a contemptuous shove, sending the smaller robot tumbling down a slight dune. As it struggled at the bottom to regain its feet, 3PO started off toward the blurred, glaring horizon, glancing back over his shoulder. Don't let me catch you following me, begging for help, he warned, because you won't get it. Below the crest of the dune, the R2 unit righted itself. It paused briefly to clean its single electronic eye with an auxiliary arm. Then it produced an electronic squeal which was almost, though not quite, a human expression of rage. Humming quietly to itself then, it trudged and turned off toward the sandstone ridges as if nothing had happened. Several hours later, straining 3PO, his internal thermostat overloaded and edging dangerously toward overheat shutdown, struggled up the top of what he hoped was the last towering dune. Nearby, pillars and buttresses of bleached calcium, the bones of some enormous beast, formed an unpromising landmark. Reaching the crest of the dune, 3PO peered anxiously ahead. Instead of the hope for greenery of human civilization, he saw only several dozen more dunes, identical in form and promise to the one he now stood upon. The farthest rose even higher than the one he presently surmounted. 3PO turned and looked back toward the now far-off rocky plateau, which was beginning to grow indistinct with distance and heat distortion. You malfunctioning little twerp, he muttered, unable even now to admit to himself that perhaps, just possibly, the R2 unit might have been right. This is all your fault. You tricked me into going this way, but you'll do no better. Nor would he if he didn't continue on. So he took a step forward and heard something grind dully within a leg joint. Sitting down in an electronic funk, he began picking sand from his encrusted joints. He could continue on his present course, he told himself, or he could confess to an error in judgment and try to catch up again with R2-D2. Neither prospect held much appeal for him. But there was a third choice. He could sit here, shining in the sunlight, until his joints locked, his internals overheated, and the ultraviolet burned out his photoreceptors. He would become another monument to the destructive power of the binary, like the colossal organism whose picked corpse he had just encountered. Already his receptors were beginning to go, he reflected. It seemed he saw something moving in the distance. Heat distortion, probably. No, it was definitely light on metal, and it was moving toward him. His hopes soared. Ignoring the warnings from his damaged leg, he rose and began waving frantically. It was, he saw now, definitely a vehicle, though of a type unfamiliar to him. But a vehicle it was, and that implied intelligence and technology. He neglected in his excitement to consider the possibility that it might not be of human origin. So I cut off my power, shut down the afterburners, and dropped in low on Deke's tail, Luke finished, waving his arms wildly. He and Biggs were walking in the shade outside the power station. Sounds of metal being worked came from within, where Fixer had finally joined his robot assistant in performing repairs. I was so close to him, Luke continued excitedly, I thought I was going to fry up my instrumentation. As it was, I busted up the Skyhopper pretty bad. That recollection inspired a frown. Uncle Owen was pretty upset. He grounded me for the rest of the season. Luke's depression was brief. Memory of his feat overrode its immortality. You should have been there, Biggs. You ought to take it a little easier, his friend cautioned. You may be the hottest bush pilot this side of Mos Eisley, Luke, but those little skyhoppers can be dangerous. They move awfully fast for a tropospheric craft, faster than they need to. Keep playing engine jockey with one, and someday, whammo! He slammed one fist violently into his open palm. You're going to be nothing more than a dark spot on the damp side of a canyon wall. Look who's talking, Luke retorted. Now that you've been on a few big automatic starships, you're beginning to sound like my uncle. You've gotten soft in the cities. He swung spiritedly at Biggs, who blocked the movement easily, making a half-hearted gesture of counterattack. Biggs' easygoing smugness dissolved into something warmer. I've missed you, kid. Luke looked away embarrassed. Things haven't been exactly the same since you left either, Biggs. It's been so... Luke hunted for the right word and finished helplessly. So quiet. His gaze traveled across the sandy, deserted streets of Anchorhead. It's always been quiet, really. Biggs grew silent, thinking. He glanced around. They were alone out here. Everyone else was back inside the comparative coolness of the power station. As he leaned close, Luke sensed an unaccustomed solemnness in his friend's tone. Luke, I didn't just come back to say goodbye, or to crow over everyone because I got through the academy. Again he seemed to hesitate, unsure of himself. Then he blurted out rapidly, not giving himself a chance to back down. But I want somebody to know. I can't tell my parents. Gaping at Biggs, Luke could only gulp. No what? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the talking that's been going on at the academy and other places, Luke. Strong talking. I made some new friends. Outsystem friends. We agreed about the way certain things are developing and... His voice dropped conspiratorially. When we reach one of the peripheral systems, we're going to jump ship and join the Alliance. Luke stared back at his friend, trying to picture Biggs, fun-loving, happy-go-lucky, live-for-today Biggs, as a patriot afire with rebellious fever. You're going to join the rebellion? He started. You gotta be kidding. How? Damp down, will you? The bigger man cautioned, glancing furtively back toward the power station. You've got a mouth like a crater. I'm sorry, Luke whispered rapidly. I'm quiet. Listen how quiet I am. You can barely hear me. Biggs cut him off and continued. A friend of mine from the academy is a friend I'm besting, who might enable us to make contact with an armed rebel unit. A friend of a... You're crazy, Luke announced with conviction, certain his friend had gone mad. You could wander around forever trying to find a real rebel outpost. Most of them are only myths. This twice-removed friend could be an Imperial agent. You'd end up on Kessel, or worse. If rebel outposts were so easy to find, the Empire would have wiped them out years ago. I know it's a long shot, Biggs admitted reluctantly. If I don't contact them, then... A peculiar light came into Biggs' eyes, a conglomeration of newfound maturity and something else. I'll do what I can on my own. He stared intensely at his friend. Luke, I'm not going to wait for the Empire to conscript me into its service. In spite of what you hear over the official information channels, the rebellion is growing, spreading, and I want to be on the right side, the side I believe in. His voice altered unpleasantly, and Luke wondered what he saw in his mind's eye. You should have heard some of the stories I've heard, Luke. Learned of some of the outrages I've learned about. The Empire may have been great and beautiful once, but the people in charge now? He shook his head sharply. It's rotten, Luke. Rotten. And I can't do a damn thing, Luke muttered morosely. I'm stuck here. He kicked futilely at the ever-present sand of Anchorhead. I thought you were going to enter the academy soon, Biggs observed. If that's so, then you'll have your chance to get off the sand pile. Luke snorted derisively. Not likely. I had to withdraw my application. He looked away, unable to meet his friend's disbelieving stare. I had to. There's been a lot of unrest among the Sand People since you left, Biggs. They've even raided the outskirts of Anchorhead. Biggs shook his head, disregarding the excuse. Your uncle could hold off a whole colony of raiders with one blaster. From the house, sure, Luke agreed. But Uncle Owen's finally got enough evaporators installed and running to make the farm pay off big. But he can't guard all that land by himself, and he says he needs me for one more season. I can't run out on him now. Biggs sighed sadly. I feel for you, Luke. Someday you're going to have to learn to separate what seems to be important from what really is important. He gestured around them. What good is all your uncle's work if it's taken over by the Empire? I've heard that they're starting to imperialize commerce in all the outlying systems. It won't be long before your uncle and everyone else on Tatooine are just tenants slaving for the greater glory of the Empire. That couldn't happen here, Luke objected with a confidence he didn't quite feel. You've said it yourself. The Empire won't bother with this rock. Things change, Luke. Only the threat of rebellion keeps many in power from doing certain unmentionable things. If that threat is completely removed, well, there are two things men have never been able to satisfy. Their curiosity and their greed. There isn't much the high imperial bureaucrats are curious about. Both men stood silent. A sand whirl traversed the street in silent majesty, collapsing against the wall to send newborn baby zephyrs in all directions. I wish I was going with you, Luke finally murmured. He glanced up. Will you be around long? No. As a matter of fact, I'm leaving in the morning to rendezvous with the Ecliptic. Then I guess I won't be seeing you again. Maybe someday, Biggs declared. He brightened, grinning that disarming grin. I'll keep a lookout for you, hotshot. Try not to run into any canyon walls in the meantime." "I'll be at the academy the season after," Luke insisted, more to encourage himself than Biggs. "After that, who knows where I'll end up?" He sounded determined. "I won't be drafted into the Starfleet, that's for sure. Take care of yourself. You'll always be the best friend I've got." There was no need for a handshake. These two had long since passed beyond that. "So long, then, Luke," Biggs said simply. He turned and re-entered the power station. Luke watched him disappear through the door, his own thoughts as chaotic and frenetic as one of Tatooine's spontaneous dust storms. There were any number of extraordinary features unique to Tatooine's surface. Outstanding among them were the mysterious mists which rose regularly from the ground at the points where desert sands washed up against unyielding cliffs and mesas. Fog in a steaming desert seemed as out of place as cactus on a glacier, but it existed nonetheless. Meteorologists and geologists argued its origin among themselves, muttering hard-to-believe theories about water suspended in sandstone veins beneath the sand, and incomprehensible chemical reactions which made water rise when the ground cooled, then fall underground again with the double sunrise. It was all very backward and very real. Neither the mist nor the alien moans of nocturnal desert dwellers troubled R2-D2, however, as he made his careful way up the rocky arroyo, hunting for the easiest pathway to the mesa top. His squarish, broad footpads made clicking sounds loud in the evening light as sand underfoot gave way gradually to gravel. For a moment he paused. He seemed to detect a noise, like metal on rock, ahead of him, instead of rock on rock. The sound wasn't repeated, though, and he quickly resumed his ambling ascent. Up the arroyo, too far up to be seen from below, a pebble trickled loose from the stone wall. The tiny figure which had accidentally dislodged the pebble retreated mouse-like into shadow. Two glowing points of light showed under overlapping folds of brown cape a meter from the narrowing canyon wall. Only the reaction of the unsuspecting robot indicated the presence of the whining beam as it struck him. For a moment, R2-D2 fluoresced eerily in the dimming light. There was a single short electronic squeak. Then the tripodal support unbalanced, and the tiny automaton toppled over onto its back, the lights on its front blinking on and off erratically from the effects of the paralyzing beam. Three travesties of men scurried out from behind concealing boulders. Their motions were more indicative of rodent than humankind, and they stood little taller than the R2 unit. When they saw that the single burst of enervating energy had immobilized the robot, they holstered their peculiar weapons. Nevertheless, they approached the listless machine cautiously, with the trepidation of hereditary cowards. Their cloaks were thickly coated with dust and sand. Unhealthy red-yellow pupils glowed cat-like from the depths of their hoods as they studied their captive. The Jawas conversed in low, guttural croaks and scrambled analogues of human speech. If, as anthropologists hypothesized, they had ever been human, they had long since degenerated past anything resembling the human race. Several more Jawas appeared. Together they succeeded in alternatively hoisting and dragging the robot back down the arroyo. At the bottom of the canyon, like some monstrous prehistoric beast, was a sandcrawler as enormous as its owners and operators were tiny. Several dozen meters high, the vehicle towered above the ground on multiple treads that were taller than a tall man. Its metal epidermis was battered and pitted from withstanding untold sandstorms. On reaching the crawler, the Jawas resumed jabbering among themselves. R2-D2 could hear them, but failed to comprehend anything. He need not have been embarrassed at his failure. If they so wished, only Jawas could understand other Jawas, for they employed a randomly variable language that drove linguists mad. One of them removed a small disc from a belt pouch and sealed it into R2's unit's flank. A large tube protruded from one side of the gargantuan vehicle. They rolled him over to it and then moved clear. There was a brief moan, the whoosh of powerful vacuum, and the small robot was sucked into the bowels of the sandcrawler as neatly as a pea up a straw. This part of the job completed, the Jawas engaged in another bout of jabbering, following which they scurried into the crawler via tubes and ladders, for all the world like a nest of mice returning to their holes. None too gently the suction tube deposited R2 in a small cubicle. In addition to various files of broken instruments and outright scrap, a dozen or so robots of differing sizes and shapes populated the prison. A few were locked in electronic conversation, others muddled aimlessly about, but when R2 tumbled into the chamber, one voice burst out in surprise. "R2-D2! It's you! It's you!" called an excited 3PO from the near darkness. He made his way over to the still immobilized repair unit and embraced it almost unmechanically. Spotting the small disc sealed onto R2's side, 3PO turned his gaze thoughtfully down to his own chest, where a similar device had likewise been attached. Massive gears, poorly lubricated, started to move. With a groaning and grinding, the monster sandcrawler turned and lumbered with relentless patience into the desert night. 3. The burnished conference table was as soulless and unyielding as the mood of the 8 Imperial senators and officers ranged around it. Imperial troopers stood guard at the entrance to the chamber, which was sparse and coldly lit from lights in the table and walls. One of the youngest of the 8 was declaiming. He exhibited the attitude of one who had climbed far and fast by methods best not examined too closely. General Tagg did possess a certain twisted genius, but it was only partly that ability which had lifted him to his present exalted position. Other noisome talents had proved equally efficacious. Though his uniform was as neatly molded and his body as clean as that of anyone else in the room, none of the remaining 7 cared to touch him. A certain sliminess clung cloyingly to him, a sensation inferred rather than tactile. Despite this, many respected him, or feared him. "I tell you he's gone too far this time," the general was insisting vehemently. "This Sith Lord inflicted on us at the urging of the Emperor will be our undoing. Until the battle station is fully operational, we remain vulnerable. Some of you still don't seem to realize how well equipped and organized the Rebel Alliance is. Their vessels are excellent, their pilots better. And they are propelled by something more powerful than mere engines, this perverse, refractory fanaticism of theirs. They're more dangerous than most of you realize." An older officer with facial scars so deeply engraved that even the best cosmetic surgery could not fully repair them, shifted nervously in his chair. "Dangerous to your Starfleet, General Tagg, but not to this battle station." Wizened eyes hopped from man to man, traveling around the table. "I happen to think Lord Vader knows what he's doing. The rebellion will continue only as long as those cowards have a sanctuary, a place where their pilots can relax and their machines can be repaired." Tagg objected. "I beg to differ with you, Ramadi. I think the construction of the station has more to do with Governor Tarkin's bid for personal power and recognition than any justifiable military strategy. Within the Senate, the rebels will continue to increase their support as long—" The sound of the single doorway sliding aside and the guards snapping to attention cut him off. His head turned, as did everyone else's. 2 individuals as different in appearance as they were united in objectives had entered the chamber. The nearest to Tagg was a thin, hatchet-faced man with hair and form borrowed from an old broom and the expression of a quiescent piranha. The Grand Moff Tarkin, governor of numerous outlying Imperial territories, was dwarfed by the broad, armored bulk of Lord Darth Vader. Tagg, unintimidated but subdued, slowly resumed his seat as Tarkin assumed his place at the end of the conference table. Vader stood next to him, a dominating presence behind the governor's chair. For a minute, Tarkin stared directly at Tagg, then glanced away as if he had seen nothing. Tagg fumed, but remained silent. As Tarkin's gaze roved around the table, a razor-thin smile of satisfaction remained frozen in his features. "The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us, gentlemen. I have just received word that the Emperor has permanently dissolved that misguided body." A ripple of astonishment ran through the assembly. "The last remnants," Tarkin continued, "of the old Republic have finally been swept away." "This is impossible," Tagg interjected. "How will the Emperor maintain control of the Imperial bureaucracy?" "Senatorial representation has not been formally abolished, you must understand," Tarkin explained. "It has merely been superseded for the—" he smiled a bit more—"duration of the emergency. Regional governors will now have direct control and a free hand in administering their territories. This means that the Imperial presence can at last be brought to bear properly on the facilitating worlds of the Empire. From now on, fear will keep potentially traitorous local governments in line. Fear of the Imperial fleets, and fear of this battle station." "And what of the existing rebellion?" Tagg wanted to know. "If the rebels somehow manage to gain access to a complete technical schema of this battle station, it is remotely possible that they might be able to locate a weakness susceptible to minor exploitation." Tarkin's smile shifted to a smirk. "Of course. We all know how well guarded, how carefully protected such vital data is.
It could not possibly fall into rebel hands. The technical data to which you're obliquely referring, rumbled Darth Vader angrily, will soon be back in our hands, if... Tarkin shook the Darth Lord off, something no one else at the table would have dared to do. It is immaterial. Any attack made against the station by the rebels would be a suicidal gesture, suicidal and useless, regardless of any information they managed to obtain. After many long years of secretive construction, he declared with evident pleasure, this station has become the decisive force in this part of the universe. Events in this region of the galaxy will no longer be determined by fate, by decree, or by any other agency. They will be decided by this station. A huge metal-clad hand gestured slightly, and one of the filled cups on the table drifted responsively into it. With a slightly admonishing tone, the Dark Lord continued. Don't become too proud of this technological terror you've spawned, Tarkin. The ability to destroy a city, a world, a whole system is still insignificant when set against the Force. The Force, Tag sneered. Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient mythology has not helped you to conjure up those stolen tapes, or gifted you with clairvoyance sufficient to locate the rebels' hidden fortress. Why, it's enough to make one laugh, fit to... Tag's eyes abruptly bulged and his hands went to his throat as he began to turn a disconcerting shade of blue. I find, Vader ventured mildly, this lack of faith disturbing. Enough of this, Tarkin snapped, distressed. Vader, release him. This bickering among ourselves is pointless. Vader shrugged as if it were of no consequence. Tag slumped in his seat, rubbing his throat, his wary gaze never leaving the dark giant. Lord Vader will provide us with the location of the rebel fortress by the time this station is certified operational, Tarkin declared. That known, we'll proceed to it and destroy it utterly, crushing his pathetic rebellion in one swift stroke. As the Emperor wills it, Vader added, not without sarcasm. So shall it be. If any of the powerful men seated around the table found this disrespectful tone objectionable, a glance at Tag was sufficient to dissuade them from mentioning it. The dim prison reeked of rancid oil and stale lubricants, a verifiable metallic charnel house. 3PO endured the discomfiting atmosphere as best he could. It was a constant battle to avoid being thrown by every unexpected bounce into the walls or into a fellow machine. To conserve power, and also to avoid the steady stream of complaints from his taller companion, R2-D2 had shut down all exterior functions. He lay inert among a pile of secondary parts, sublimely unconcerned at the moment as to their fate. Will this never end? 3PO was moaning as another violent jolt roughly jostled the inhabitants of the prison. He had already formulated and discarded 100 horrible ends. He was certain only that their eventual disposition was sure to be worse than anything he could imagine. Then, quite without warning, something more unsettling than even the most battering bump took place. The sandcrawler's whine died, and the vehicle came to a halt, almost as if in response to 3PO's query. A nervous buzz rose from those mechanicals who still retained a semblance of sentience as they speculated on their present location and probable fate. At least 3PO was no longer ignorant of his captors or of their likely motives. Local captives had explained the nature of the quasi-human mechanic migrants, the Jawas. Traveling in their enormous mobile fortress homes, they scoured the most inhospitable regions of Tatooine in search of valuable minerals and salvageable machinery. They had never been seen outside of their protective cloaks and sand masks, so no one knew exactly what they looked like, but they were reputed to be extraordinarily ugly. 3PO did not have to be convinced. Leaning over his still motionless companion, he began a steady shaking of the barrel-like torso. Epidermal sensors were activated on the R2 unit, and the lights on the front side of the little robot began a sequential awakening. Wake up! Wake up! 3PO urged. We've stopped someplace. Like several of the other, more imaginative robots, his eyes were warily scanning metal walls, expecting a hidden panel to slide aside at any moment and a giant mechanical arm to come probing and fumbling for him. No doubt about it, we're doomed, he recited mournfully as R2 righted himself, returning to full activation. Do you think they'll melt us down? He became silent for several minutes and added, It's this waiting that gets to me. Abruptly, the far wall of the chamber slid aside, and the blinding white glare of a Tatooine morning rushed in on them. 3PO's sensitive photoreceptors were hard-pressed to adjust in time to prevent serious damage. Several of the repulsive-looking Jawas scrambled agilely into the chamber, still dressed in the same swathings and filth 3PO had observed on them before. Using hand weapons of an unknown design, they prodded at the machines. Certain of them, 3PO noted with a mental swallow, did not stir. Ignoring the immobile ones, the Jawas herded those still capable of movement outside, R2 and 3PO among them. Both robots found themselves part of an uneven mechanical line. Shielding his eyes against the glare, 3PO saw that 5 of them were arranged alongside the huge sandcrawler. Thoughts of escape did not enter his mind. Such a concept was utterly alien to a mechanical. The more intelligent a robot was, the more abhorrent and unthinkable the concept. Besides, had he tried to escape, built-in sensors would have detected the critical logic malfunction and melted every circuit in his brain. Instead, he studied the small domes and evaporators that indicated the presence of a larger underground human homestead. Though he was unfamiliar with this type of construction, all signs pointed to a modest, isolated habitation. Thoughts of being dismembered for parts or slaving in some high-temperature mine slowly faded. His spirits rose correspondingly. "Maybe this won't be so bad after all," he murmured hopefully. "If we can convince these bipedal vermin to unload us here, we may enter into sensible human service again, instead of being melted into slag." R2's sole reply was a non-committal chirp. Both machines became silent as the Jawas commenced scurrying around them, striving to straighten one poor machine with a badly bent spine, to disguise a dent or scrape with liquid and dust. As 2 of them bustled about, working on his sand-coated skin, 3PO fought to stifle an expression of disgust. One of his many human analog functions was the ability to react naturally to offensive odors. Apparently hygiene was unknown among the Jawas, but he was certain no good would come of pointing this out to them. Small insects drifted in clouds about the faces of the Jawas who ignored them. Apparently the tiny individualized plagues were regarded as just a different sort of appendage, like an extra arm or leg. So intent was 3PO on his observation that he failed to notice the 2 figures moving toward them from the region of the largest dome. R2 had to nudge him silently before he looked up. The first man wore an air of grim, semi-perpetual exhaustion, sandblasted into his face by too many years of arguing with a hostile environment. His graying hair was frozen in tangled twists like gypsum halactites. Dust frosted his face, clothes, hands, and thoughts. But the body, if not the spirit, was still powerful. Proportionately dwarfed by his uncle's wrestler-like body, Luke strode slump-shouldered in his shadow, his present attitude one of dejection rather than exhaustion. He had a great deal on his mind, and it had very little to do with farming. Mostly it involved the rest of his life, and the commitment made by his best friend who had recently departed beyond the blue sky above to enter a harsher yet more rewarding career. The bigger man stopped before the assembly and entered into a peculiar squeaky dialogue with the Jawa in charge. When they wished it, the Jawas could be understood. Luke stood nearby, listening indifferently. Then he shuffled along behind his uncle as the latter began inspecting the 5 machines, pausing only to mutter an occasional word or two to his nephew. It was hard to pay attention, even though he knew he ought to be learning. "Luke! Oh, Luke!" a voice called. Turning away from the conversation, which consisted of the lead Jawa extolling the unmatched virtues of all 5 machines and his uncle countering with derision, Luke walked over to the near edge of the subterranean courtyard and peered down. A stout woman with the expression of a misplaced sparrow was busy working among decorative plants. She looked up at him. "Be sure and tell Owen that if he buys a translator to make sure it speaks Bocce, Luke." Turning, Luke looked back over his shoulder and studied the motley collection of tired machines. "It looks like we don't have much of a choice," he called back down to her, "but I'll remind him anyway." She nodded up at him, and he turned to rejoin his uncle. Apparently Owen Lars had already come to a decision, having settled on a small, semi-agricultural robot. This one was similar in shape to R2-D2, save that its multiple subsidiary arms were tipped with different functions. At an order, it had stepped out of the line and was wobbling along behind Owen and the temporarily subdued Jawa. Proceeding to the end of the line, the farmer's eyes narrowed as he concentrated on the sand-scoured but still flashy bronze finish of the tall, humanoid 3PO. "I presume you function?" he grumbled at the robot. "Do you know customs and protocol?" "Do I know protocol?" 3PO echoed, as the farmer looked him up and down. 3PO was determined to embarrass the Jawa when it came to selling his abilities. "Do I know protocol? Why, it's my primary function. I am also, well Don't need a protocol droid, the farmer snapped dryly. I don't blame you, sir, 3PO rapidly agreed. I couldn't be more in agreement. What could be more of a wasteful luxury in a climate like this? For someone of your interest, sir, a protocol droid would be a useless waste of money.
No, sir. Versatility is my middle name. CV3PO. V for versatility, at your service. I've been programmed for over 30 secondary functions that require only...
I need, the farmer broke in, demonstrating imperious disregard for 3PO's as yet unenumerated secondary functions. A droid that knows something about the binary language of independently programmable moisture evaporators. Vaporators! We are both in luck, 3PO countered. My first post-primary assignment was in programming binary load lifters. Very similar in construction and memory function to your evaporators. You could almost say... Luke tapped his uncle on the shoulder and whispered something in his ear. His uncle nodded, then looked back at the attentive 3PO again. Do you speak Bocce? Of course, sir, 3PO replied, confident for a change with a wholly honest answer. It's like a second language to me. I'm as fluent in Bocce as... The farmer appeared determined never to allow him to conclude a sentence. Shut up. Owen Lars looked down at the Jawa. I'll take this one, too. Shutting up, sir, responded 3PO quickly, hard put to conceal his glee at being selected. Take them down to the garage, Luke, his uncle instructed him. I want you to have both of them cleaned up by supper time. Luke looked askance at his uncle. But I was going into Tossie Station to pick up some new power converters and... Don't lie to me, Luke, his uncle warned him sternly. I don't mind you wasting time with your idle friends, but only after you've finished your chores. Now hop to it, and before supper, mind. Downcast, Luke directed his words irritably to 3PO and the small agricultural robot. He knew better than to argue with his uncle. Follow me, you two. They started for the garage as Owen entered into price negotiations with the Jawa. Other Jawas were leading the 3 remaining machines back into the sandcrawler when something let out an almost pathetic beep. Luke turned to see an R2 unit breaking formation and starting toward him. It was immediately restrained by a Jawa wielding a control device that activated the disc sealed on the machine's front plate. Luke studied the rebellious droid curiously. 3PO started to say something, considered the circumstances, and thought better of it. Instead, he remained silent, staring straight ahead. A minute later, something pinged sharply nearby. Glancing down, Luke saw that the head plate had popped off the top of the agricultural droid. A grinding noise was coming from within. A second later, the machine was throwing internal components all over the sandy ground. Leaning close, Luke peered inside the expiatorial mechanical. He called out, Uncle Owen, the servo motor central in this cultivator unit is shot. Look. He reached in, tried to adjust the device, and pulled away hurriedly when it began a wild sparking. The odor of crisp insulation and corroded circuitry filled the clear desert air with a pungy redolent of mechanized death. Owen Lars glared down at the nervous Jawa. What kind of junk are you trying to push on us? The Jawa responded loudly, indignantly, while simultaneously taking a couple of precautionary steps away from the big human. He was distressed that the man was between him and the soothing safety of the sandcrawler. Meanwhile, R2-D2 had scuttled out of the group of machines being led back toward the mobile fortress. Doing so turned out to be simple enough, since all the Jawas had their attention focused on the argument between their leader and Luke's uncle. Lacking sufficient armament for wild gesticulation, the R2 unit suddenly let out a high whistle, then broke it off when it was apparent he had gained 3PO's attention. Tapping Luke gently on the shoulder, the tall droid whispered conspiratorially into his ear. If I might say so, young sir, that R2 unit is a real bargain, in top condition. I don't believe these creatures have any idea what good shape he's really in. Don't let all the sand and dust deceive you. Luke was in the habit of making instant decisions, for good or bad. Anyway, Uncle Owen, he called. Breaking off the argument without taking his attention from the Jawa, his uncle glanced quickly at him. Luke gestured toward R2-D2. We don't want any trouble. What about swapping this? He indicated the burned-out agricultural droid, for that one. The older man studied the R2 unit professionally, then considered the Jawas. Though inherently cowards, the tiny desert scavengers could be pushed too far. The sandcrawler could flatten the homestead, at the risk of inciting the human community to lethal vengeance. Faced with a no-win situation for either side if he pressed too hard, Owen resumed the argument for show's sake before gruffly assenting. The head Jawa consented reluctantly to the trade, and both sides breathed a mental sigh of relief. The hostilities had been avoided. While the Jawa bowed and whined with impatient greed, Owen paid him off. Meanwhile, Luke had led the 2 robots toward an opening in the dry ground.
A few seconds later they were striding down a ramp kept clear of drifting sand by electrostatic repellers. "Don't you ever forget this," 3PO muttered to R2, leaning over the smaller machine. "Why I stick my neck out for you when all you ever bring me is trouble is beyond my capacity to comprehend." The passage widened into the garage proper, which was cluttered with tools and sections of farming machinery. Many looked heavily used, some to the point of collapse. But the lights were comforting to both droids, and there was a hominess to the chamber which hinted at a tranquility not experienced by either machine for a long time. Near the center of the garage was a large tub, and the aroma drifting from it made 3PO's principal olfactory sensors twitch. Luke grinned, noting the robot's reaction. "Yes, it's a lubrication bath." He eyed the tall bronze droid appraisingly, and from the looks of it, you could use about a week's submergence, but we can't afford that, so you have to settle for an afternoon. Then Luke turned his attention to R2-D2, walking up to him and flipping open a panel that shielded numerous gauges. "As for you," he continued with a whistle of surprise, "I don't know how you've kept running." Not surprising, knowing the Jawa's reluctance to part with any erg fraction they don't have to. "It's recharge time for you." He gestured toward a large power unit. R2-D2 followed Luke's gesture, then beeped once and waddled over to the boxy contraption. Finding the proper cord, he automatically flipped open a panel and plugged the triple prongs into his face. 3PO had walked over to the large cistern, which was filled almost full with aromatic cleansing oil. With a remarkably human-like sigh, he lowered himself slowly into the tank. "You two behave yourselves," Luke cautioned them as he moved to a small, two-man skyhopper. A powerful little suborbital spacecraft, it rested in the hangar section of the garage workshop. "I've got work of my own to do." Unfortunately, Luke's energies were still focused on his farewell encounter with Biggs, so that hours later he had finished few of his chores. Thinking about his friend's departure, Luke was running a caressing hand over the damaged port fin of the hopper, the fin he had damaged while running down an imaginary TIE fighter in the wrenching twists and turns of a narrow canyon. That was when the projecting ledge had clipped him as effectively as an energy beam. Abruptly, something came to a boil within him. With atypical violence, he threw a power wrench across the work table nearby. "It just isn't fair," he declared to no one in particular. His voice dropped disconsolately. "Biggs is right. I'll never get out of here. He's planning a rebellion against the Empire, and I'm trapped on a blight of a farm." "I beg your pardon, sir." Luke spun, startled, but it was only the tall droid, 3PO. The contrast in the robot was striking compared with Luke's initial sight of him. Bronze-colored alloy gleamed in the overhead lights of the garage, cleaned of pits and dust by the powerful oils. "Is there anything I might do to help?" the robot asked solicitously. Luke studied the machine, and as he did so, some of his anger drained away. There was no point in yelling cryptically at a robot. "I doubt it," he replied, "unless you can alter time and speed up the harvest, or else teleport me off this sand pile under Uncle Owen's nose." Sarcasm was difficult for even an extremely sophisticated robot to detect, so 3PO considered the question objectively before finally replying. "I don't think so, sir. I'm only a third-degree droid and not very knowledgeable about such things as transmatic physics." Suddenly, the events of the past couple of days seemed to catch up with him all at once. "As a matter of fact, young sir," 3PO went on while looking around him with fresh vision, "I'm not even sure which planet I'm on." Luke chuckled sardonically and assumed a mocking pose. "If there's a bright center to this universe, you're on the world farthest from it." "Yes, Luke, sir." The youth shook his head irritably. "Never mind the sir, it's just Luke, and this world is called Tatooine." 3PO nodded slightly. "Thank you, Luke. I am C-3PO, Human Droid Relations Specialist." He jerked a casual metal thumb back toward the recharge unit. "That is my companion, R2-D2. "Pleased to meet you, 3PO, Luke said easily. "You too, R2. Walking across the garage, he checked a gauge on the smaller machine's front panel, then gave a grunt of satisfaction. As he began unplugging the charge cord, he saw something which made him frown and lean close. "Something wrong, Luke?" 3PO inquired. Luke went to a nearby tool wall and selected a small, many-armed device. "I don't know yet, 3PO." Returning to the recharger, Luke bent over R2 and began scraping at several bumps in the small droid's top with a chromed pick. Occasionally, he jerked back sharply as bits of corrosion were flicked into the air by the tiny tool. 3PO watched, interested as Luke worked. "There's a lot of strange carbon scoring here of a type I'm not familiar with. Looks like you've both seen a lot of action out of the ordinary." "Indeed, sir," 3PO admitted, forgetting to drop the honorific. This time, Luke was too absorbed elsewhere to correct him.
Sometimes I'm amazed we're in as good a shape as we are, he added as an afterthought, while still shying away from the thrust of Luke's question. What with the rebellion and all? Despite his caution, it seemed to 3PO that he must have given something away, for an almost jowl-like blaze appeared in Luke's eyes. You know about the rebellion against the Empire? He demanded. In a way, 3PO confessed reluctantly. The rebellion was responsible for our coming into your service. We are refugees, you see. He did not add from where. Not that Luke appeared to care. Refugees! Then I did see a space battle. He rambled on rapidly, excited. Tell me where you've been, and how many encounters. How's the rebellion going? Does the Empire take it seriously? Have you seen many ships destroyed? A bit slower, please, sir, 3PO pleaded. You misinterpret our status. We were innocent bystanders. Our involvement with the rebellion was of the most marginal nature. As to battles we were in, several, I think. It is difficult to tell when one is not directly in contact with the actual battle machinery. He shrugged neatly. Beyond that, there's not much to say. Remember, sir, I am little more than a cosmeticized interpreter, and not very good at telling stories or relating histories, and even less proficient at embellishing them. I am a very literal machine. Luke turned away, disappointed, and returned to his cleaning of R2-D2. Additional scraping turned up something puzzling enough to demand his full attention. A small metal fragment was tightly lodged between two bar conduits that would normally form a linkage. Setting down the delicate pick, Luke switched to a larger instrument. Well, my little friend, he murmured, you got something jammed in here real good. As he pushed and pried, Luke directed half his attention to 3PO. Were you on a star freighter, or was it... Metal gave way with a powerful crack, and the recoil sent Luke tumbling head over heels. Getting to his feet, he started to curse, then froze, motionless. The front of the R2 unit had begun to glow, exuding a three-dimensional image less than 1/3 of a meter square, but precisely defined. The portrait formed within the box was so exquisite that in a couple of minutes Luke discovered he was out of breath, because he had forgotten to breathe. Despite a superficial sharpness, the image flickered and jiggled unsteadily, as if the recording had been made and installed with haste. Luke stared at the foreign colors being projected into the prosaic atmosphere of the garage, and started to form a question, but it was never finished. The lips on the figure moved, and the girl spoke, or rather, seemed to speak. Luke knew the oral accompaniment was generated somewhere within R2-D2's squat torso. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the voice implored huskily, help me, you're my only remaining hope. A burst of static dissolved the face momentarily, then it coalesced again, and once more the voice repeated, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only remaining hope. With a raspy hum, the hologram continued. Luke sat perfectly still for a long moment, considering what he was seeing, then he blinked and directed his words to the R2 unit. What's this all about, R2-D2? The stubby droid shifted slightly, the cubish portrait shifting with him, and beeped what sounded vaguely like a sheepish reply. 3PO appeared as mystified as Luke. What is that? He inquired sharply, gesturing at the speaking portrait and then at Luke. You were asked a question. What and who is that, and how are you originating it, and why? The R2 unit generated a beep of surprise, for all the world as if just noticing the hologram. This was followed by a whistling stream of information. 3PO digested the data, tried to frown, couldn't, and strove to convey his own confusion via the tone of his voice. He insists it's nothing, sir. Merely a malfunction. Old data. A tape that should have been erased but was missed. He insists we pay it no mind. That was like telling Luke to ignore a cache of Durin fires he might stumble over in the desert. Who is she? He demanded, staring enraptured at the hologram. She's beautiful. I really don't know who she is, 3PO confessed honestly. I think she might have been a passenger on our last voyage. From what I recall, she was a personage of some importance. This might have something to do with the fact that our captain was attaché to. Luke cut him off, savoring the way sensuous lips formed and reformed the sentence fragment. Is there any more to this recording? It sounds like it's incomplete. Getting to his feet, Luke reached out for the R2 unit. The robot moved backward and produced whistles of such frantic concern that Luke hesitated and held off reaching for the internal controls. 3PO was shocked. Behave yourself, R2, he finally chastised his companion. You're going to get us into trouble. He had visions of the both of them being packed up as uncooperative and shipped back to the Jawas, which was enough to make him imitate a shudder. It's all right. He's our master now, 3PO indicated Luke. You can trust him. I feel that he has our best interests in mind. R2 appeared to hesitate, uncertain. Then he whistled and beeped a long complexity at his friend.
Well, Luke prompted impatiently. 3PO paused before replying. He says that he is the property of one Obi-Wan Kenobi, a resident of this world, of this very region, in fact. The sentence fragment we are hearing is part of a private message intended for this person. 3PO shook his head slowly. Quite frankly, sir, I don't know what he's talking about. Our last master was Captain Colton. I never heard R2 mention a prior master. I've certainly never heard of an Obi-Wan Kenobi. But with all we've been through, he concluded apologetically, I'm afraid his logic circuits have gotten a bit scrambled. He's become decidedly eccentric at times. And while Luke considered this turn of events, 3PO took the opportunity to throw R2 a furious look of warning. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke recited thoughtfully. His expression suddenly brightened. Say, I wonder if he could be referring to old Ben Kenobi. Begging your pardon? 3PO gulped, astonished beyond measure. But you actually know of such a person? Not exactly, he admitted in a more subdued voice. I don't know anyone named Obi-Wan, but old Ben lives somewhere out on the fringe of the Western Dune Sea. He's kind of a local character, a hermit. Uncle Owen and a few of the other farmers say he's a sorcerer. He's come around once in a while to trade things. I hardly ever talk to him, though. My uncle usually runs him off. He paused and glanced across at the small robot again. But I never heard that old Ben owned a droid of any kind. At least none that I ever heard of. Luke's gaze was drawn irresistibly back to the hologram. I wonder who she is. She must be important, especially if what you told me just now is true, 3PO. She sounds and looks as if she's in some kind of trouble. Maybe the message is important. We ought to hear the rest of it. He reached again for the R2's internal controls, and the robot scurried backward again, squeaking a blue streak. He says there's a restraining separator bolt that's circuiting out his self-motivation components, 3PO translated. He suggests that if you move the bolt, he might be able to repeat the entire message. 3PO finished uncertainly. When Luke continued to stare at the portrait, 3PO added more loudly, Sir! Luke shook himself. What? Oh, yes. He considered the request. Then he moved and peered into the open panel. This time, R2 didn't retreat. I see it, I think. Well, I guess you're too small to run away from me if I take this off. I wonder what someone would be sending a message to old Ben for. Selecting the proper tool, Luke reached down into the exposed circuitry and popped the restraining bolt free. The first noticeable result of this action was that the portrait disappeared. Luke stood back. There now. There was an uncomfortable pause during which the hologram showed no sign of returning. Where did she go? Luke finally prompted. Make her come back. Play the entire message, R2-D2. An innocent-sounding beep came from the robot. 3PO appeared embarrassed and nervous as he translated. He said, What message? 3PO's attention turned half angrily to his companion. What message? You know what message. The one you just played a fragment of for us. The one you're hauling around inside your recalcitrant, rust-ridden innards, you stubborn hunk of junk. R2 sat and hummed softly to himself. I'm sorry, sir, 3PO said slowly, but he shows signs of having developed an alarming flutter in his obedience rationale module. Perhaps if we... A voice from down a corridor interrupted him. Luke! Oh, Luke! Come to dinner! Luke hesitated, then rose and turned away from the puzzling little droid. Okay, he called. I'm coming, Aunt Beru. He lowered his voice as he spoke to 3PO. See what you can do with him. I'll be back soon. Tossing the just-removed restraining bolt on the workbench, he hurried from the chamber. As soon as the human was gone, 3PO whirled on his shorter companion. You'd better consider playing that whole recording for him, he growled, with a suggestive nod toward a workbench laden with dismembered machine parts. Otherwise, he's liable to take up that cleaning pick again and go digging for it. He might not be too careful what he cuts through if he believes you're deliberately withholding something from him. A plaintive beep came from R2. No, 3PO responded. I don't think he likes you at all. A second beep failed to alter the stern tone in the taller robot's voice. No, I don't like you either. 4. Luke's Aunt Beru was filling a pitcher with blue liquid from a refrigerated container. Behind her in the dining area, a steady buzz of conversation reached to the kitchen. She sighed sadly. The mealtime discussions between her husband and Luke had grown steadily more acrimonious as the boy's restlessness pulled him in directions other than farming. Directions for which Owen, a stolid man of the soil if there ever was one, had absolutely no sympathy. Returning the bulk container to the refrigerator unit, she placed the pitcher on a tray and hurried back to the dining room. Beru was not a brilliant woman, but she possessed an instinctive understanding of her important position in this household. She functioned like the dampening rods to a nuclear reactor. As long as she was present, Owen and Luke would continue to generate a lot of heat, but if she was out of their presence for too long, boom! Condenser units built into the bottom of each plate kept the food on the dining room table hot as she hurried in. Immediately, both men lowered their voices to something civilized and shifted the subject. Beru pretended not to notice the change. "I think that R2 unit might have been stolen, Uncle Owen," Luke was saying, as if that had been the topic of conversation all along. His uncle helped himself to the milk pitcher, mumbling his reply around a mouthful of food. "The Jawas have a tendency to pick up anything that's not tied down, Luke, but remember, they're basically afraid of their own shadows. To resort to outright theft, they'd have to have considered the consequences of being pursued and punished. Theoretically, their minds shouldn't be capable of that. What makes you think the droid is stolen?" "For one thing, it's in awfully good shape for discard. It generated a hologram recording while I was cleaning." Luke tried to conceal his horror at the slip. He added hastily, "But that's not important. The reason I think it might be stolen is because it claims to be the property of someone it calls Obi-Wan Kenobi." Maybe something in the food, or perhaps the milk, caused Luke's uncle to gag. Then again, it might have been an expression of disgust, which was Owen's way of indicating his opinion of that particular personage. In any case, he continued eating without looking up at his nephew. Luke pretended the display of graphic dislike had never happened. "I thought," he continued determinedly, "it might have meant old Ben. The first name is different, but the last is identical." When his uncle steadfastly maintained his silence, Luke prompted him directly. "Do you know who he's talking about, Uncle Owen?" Surprisingly, his uncle looked uncomfortable instead of angry. "It's nothing," he mumbled, still not meeting Luke's gaze. "A name from another time." He squirmed nervously in his seat. "A name that can only mean trouble." Luke refused to heed the implied warning and pressed on. "Is it someone related to old Ben, then?" "I didn't know he had any relatives." "You stay away from that old wizard, you hear me?" his uncle exploded, awkwardly substituting threat for reason. "Owen," Aunt Beru started to interject gently, but the big farmer cut her off sternly. "Now this is important, Beru." He turned his attention back to his nephew. "I've told you about Kenobi before. He's a crazy old man. He's dangerous and full of mischief, and he's best left well alone." Beru's pleading gaze caused him to quiet somewhat. "That droid has nothing to do with him. Couldn't have." He grumbled half to himself. "Recording. Huh. Well, tomorrow I want you to take the unit into Anchorhead and have its memory flushed." Snorting, Owen bent to his half-eaten meal with determination. "That will be the end of this foolishness. I don't care where that machine thinks it came from. I paid hard credit for it, and it belongs to us now." "But suppose it does belong to someone else," Luke wondered. "What if this Obi-Wan person comes looking for his droid?" An expression between sorrow and a sneer crossed his uncle's seamed face at a remembrance. "He won't. I don't think that man exists anymore. He died about the same time as your father." A huge mouthful of hot food was shoveled inward. "Now forget about it." "Then it was a real person," Luke murmured, staring down at his plate. He added slowly, "Did he know my father?" "I said forget about it," Owen snapped. "Your only worry as far as those two droids are concerned is having them ready for work tomorrow. Remember, the last of our savings is tied up in those two. Wouldn't even have bought them if it wasn't so near harvest." He shook a spoon at his nephew. "In the morning I want you to have them working with the irrigation units up on the South Ridge." "You know," Luke replied distantly, "I think these droids are going to work out fine. In fact, He hesitated, shooting his uncle a surreptitious glance. "I was thinking about our agreement about me staying on for another season." His uncle failed to react, so Luke rushed on before his nerve failed. "If these new droids do work out, I want to transmit my application to enter the academy for next year." Owen scowled, trying to hide his displeasure with food. "You mean you want to transmit the application next year, after the harvest?" "You've more than enough droids now, and they're in good condition. They'll last." "Droids, yes," his uncle agreed, "but droids can't replace a man, Luke. You know that. The harvest is when I need you the most. It's just for one more season after this one." He looked away, bluster and anger gone now. Luke toyed with his food, not eating, saying nothing. "Listen," his uncle told him, "for the first time we got a chance for a real fortune. We'll make enough to hire some extra hands for next time. Not droids. People. Then you can go to the academy." He fumbled over words, unaccustomed to pleading. "I need you here, Luke. You understand that, don't you?"
It's another year, his nephew objected sullenly. Another year. How many times had he heard that before? How many times had they repeated this identical charade with the same result? Convinced once more that Luke had come round to his way of thinking, Owen shrugged the objection off. Time will pass before you know it. Abruptly, Luke rose, shoving his barely touched plate of food aside. That's what you said last year when Biggs left. He spun and half ran from the room. Where are you going, Luke? His aunt yelled worriedly after him. Luke's reply was bleak, bitter. Looks like I'm going nowhere. Then he added, out of consideration for his aunt's sensibilities, I have to finish cleaning those droids if they're going to be ready to work tomorrow. Silence hung in the air of the dining room after Luke departed. Husband and wife ate mechanically. Eventually, Aunt Beru stopped shoving her food around her plate, looked up, and pointed out earnestly, Owen, you can't keep him here forever. Most of his friends are gone, the people he grew up with. The academy means so much to him. Listlessly, her husband replied, I'll make it up to him next year, I promise. We'll have money. Or maybe the year after that. Luke's just not a farmer, Owen, she continued firmly. He never will be, no matter how hard you try to make him one. She shook her head slowly. He's got too much of his father in him. For the first time all evening, Owen Lars looked thoughtful as well as concerned as he gazed down the passage Luke had taken. That's what I'm afraid of, he whispered. Luke had gone topside. He stood on the sand watching the double sunset as first one and then the other of Tatooine's twin suns sank slowly behind the distant range of dunes. In the fading light, the sands turned gold, russet, and flaming red-orange before advancing night put the bright colors to sleep for another day. Soon, for the first time, those sands would blossom with food plants. This former wasteland would see an eruption of green. The thought ought to have sent a thrill of anticipation through Luke. He should have been as flushed with excitement as his uncle was whenever he described the coming harvest. Instead, Luke felt nothing but a vast, indifferent emptiness. Not even the prospect of having a lot of money for the first time in his life excited him. What was there to do with money in Anchorhead, anywhere on Tatooine for that matter? Part of him, an increasingly large part, was growing more and more restless at remaining unfulfilled. This was not an uncommon feeling in youths his age, but for reasons Luke did not understand, it was much stronger in him than in any of his friends. As the night cold came creeping over the sand and up his legs, he brushed the grit from his trousers and descended into the garage. Maybe working on the droids would bury some of the remorse a little deeper in his mind. A quick survey of the chamber showed no movement. Neither of the new machines was in sight. Frowning slightly, Luke took a small control box from his belt and activated a couple of switches set into the plastic. A low hum came from the box. The caller produced the taller of the two robots, 3PO. In fact, he gave a small yell of surprise as he jumped up behind the skyhopper. Luke started toward him, openly puzzled. What are you hiding back there for? The robot came stumbling around the prow of the craft, his attitude one of desperation. It occurred to Luke then that despite his activating the collar, the R2 unit was still nowhere to be seen. The reason for his absence, or something related to it, came pouring unbidden from 3PO. It wasn't my fault, the robot begged frantically. Please don't deactivate me. I told him not to go, but he's faulty. He must be malfunctioning. Something has totally boiled his logic circuits. He kept babbling on about some sort of mission, sir. I never heard a robot with delusions of grandeur before. Such things shouldn't even be within the cognitive theory units of one that's as basic as an R2 unit and... You mean... Luke started to gape. Yes, sir. He's gone. And I removed his restraining coupling myself, Luke muttered slowly. Already he could visualize his uncle's face. The last of their savings tied up in these droids, he had said. Racing out of the garage, Luke hunted for non-existent reasons why the R2 unit should go berserk. 3PO followed on his heels. From a small ridge which formed the highest point close by the homestead, Luke had a panoramic view of the surrounding desert. Bringing out the precious macro binoculars, he scanned the rapidly darkening horizons for something small, metallic, three-legged, and out of its mechanical mind. 3PO fought his way up through the sand to stand beside Luke. That R2 unit has always caused nothing but trouble, he groaned. Astromech droids are becoming too iconoclastic even for me to understand sometimes. The binoculars finally came down, and Luke commented matter-of-factly. Well, he's nowhere in sight. He kicked furiously at the ground. Damn it! How could I have been so stupid, letting it trick me into removing that restrainer? Uncle Owen's going to kill me.
Begging your pardon, sir, ventured a hopeful Threepio, visions of Jawas dancing in his head. But can't we go after him? Luke turned. Studiously he examined the wall of black advancing toward them. Not at night. It's too dangerous for all the raiders around. I'm not too concerned about the Jawas, but Sand People. No, not in the dark. We'll have to wait until morning to try to track him. A shout rose from the homestead below. Luke! Luke, are you finished with those droids yet? I'm turning down the power for the night. All right, Luke responded, sidestepping the question. I'll be down in a few minutes, Uncle Owen. Turning, he took one last look at the vanished horizon. Boy, am I in for it, he muttered. That little droid's going to get me in a lot of trouble. Oh, he excels at that, sir, Threepio confirmed with mock cheerfulness. Luke threw him a sour look, and together they turned and descended into the garage. Luke! Luke! Still rubbing the morning sleep from his eyes, Owen glanced from side to side, loosening his neck muscles. Where could that boy be loafing now? He wondered aloud at the lack of response. There was no sign of movement in the homestead, and he had already checked above. Luke! He yelled again. Luke, Luke, Luke! The name echoed teasingly back at him from the homestead walls. Turning angrily, he stalked back into the kitchen, where Beru was preparing breakfast. Have you seen Luke this morning? He asked as softly as he could manage. She glanced briefly at him, then returned to her cooking. Yes. He said he had some things to do before he started out to the South Ridge this morning, so we left early. Before breakfast? Owen frowned worriedly. That's not like him. Did he take the new droids with him? I think so. I'm sure I saw at least one of them with him. Well, Owen mused, uncomfortable, but with nothing to really hang imprecations on. He'd better have those Ridge units repaired by midday or there'll be hell to pay. An unseen face shielded by smooth white metal emerged from the half-buried life pod that now formed the back of the dune slightly higher than its neighbors. The voice sounded efficient, but tired. Nothing, the inspecting trooper muttered to his several companions. No tapes and no sign of habitation. Powerful handguns lowered at the information that the pod was deserted. One of the armored men turned, calling out to an officer standing some distance away. This is definitely the pod that cleared the rebel ship, sir, but there's nothing on board. Yet it sit down intact, the officer was murmuring to himself. It could have done so in automatics, but if it was a true malfunction, then it shouldn't have been engaged. Something didn't make sense. Here's why there's nothing on board and no hint of life, sir, a voice declared. The officer turned and strode several paces to where another trooper was kneeling in the sand. He held up an object for the officer's inspection. It shone in the sun. Droid plating, the officer observed after a quick glance at the metal fragment. Superior and underling exchanged a significant glance. Then their eyes turned simultaneously to the high mesas off to the north. Gravel and fine sand formed a gritty fog beneath the land speeder as it slid across the rippling wasteland of Tatooine on humming repulsors. Occasionally the craft would jog slightly as it encountered a dip or slight rise, to return to its smooth passes as its pilot compensated for the change in terrain. Luke leaned back in the seat, luxuriating in unaccustomed relaxation as Threepio skillfully directed the powerful landcraft around dunes and rocky outcrops. You handle land speeder pretty well for a machine, he noted admiringly. Thank you, sir, a gratified Threepio responded, his eyes never moving from the landscape ahead. I was not lying to your uncle when I claimed versatility as my middle name. In fact, on occasion I have been called upon to perform unexpected functions in circumstances which would have appalled my designers. Something pinged behind them, then pinged again. Luke frowned and popped the speeder canopy. A few moments of digging in the motor casing eliminated the metallic bark. How's that? He yelled forward. Threepio signaled that the adjustment was satisfactory. Luke turned back into the cockpit and closed the canopy over them again. Silently, he brushed his wind-whipped hair back out of his eyes as his attention returned to the dry desert ahead of them. Old Ben Kenobi is supposed to live out in this general direction, even though nobody knows exactly where. I don't see how that R2 unit could have come this far so quickly. His expression was downcast. We must have missed him back in the dunes somewhere. He could be anywhere out here, and Uncle Owen must be wondering why I haven't called in from the South Ridge by now. Threepio considered a moment, then ventured. Would it help, sir, if you told him that it was my fault? Luke appeared to brighten at the suggestion. Sure, he needs you twice as much now.
Probably he'll only deactivate you for a day or so, or give you a partial memory flush. Deactivate? Memory flush? 3PO added hastily. On second thought, sir, R2 would still be around if you hadn't removed his restraining module. But something more important than fixing responsibility for the little robot's disappearance was on Luke's mind at the moment. Wait a minute, he advised 3PO as he stared fixedly at the instrument panel. There's something dead ahead on the metal scanner. Can't distinguish outlines at this distance, but judging by size alone, it could be our wandering droid. Hit it. The land speeder jumped forward as 3PO engaged the accelerator, but its occupants were totally unaware that other eyes were watching as the craft increased its speed. Those eyes were not organic, but then they weren't wholly mechanical either. No one could say for certain, because no one had ever made that intimate a study of the Tusken Raiders, known less formally to the margin farmers of Tatooine simply as the Sand People. The Tuskens didn't permit close study of themselves, discouraging potential observers by methods as effective as they were uncivilized. A few xenobiologists thought they might be related to the Jawas. Even fewer hypothesized that the Jawas were actually the mature form of the Sand People, but this theory is discounted by the majority of serious scientists. Both races affected tight clothing to shield them from Tatooine's twin dose of solar radiation, but there most comparisons ended. Instead of heavy woven cloaks like the Jawas wore, the Sand People wrapped themselves mummy-like in endless swathings and bandages and loose bits of cloth. Where the Jawas feared everything, a Tusken Raider feared little. The Sand People were larger, stronger, and far more aggressive. Fortunately for the human colonists of Tatooine, they were not very numerous and elected to pursue their nomadic existence in some of Tatooine's most desolate regions. Contact between human and Tusken, therefore, was infrequent and uneasy, and they murdered no more than a handful of humans per year. Since the human population had claimed its share of Tuskens, not always with reason, a peace of a sort existed between the two, as long as neither side gained an advantage. One of the pair felt that unstable condition had temporarily shifted in his favor, and he was about to take full advantage of it as he raised his rifle toward the land speeder. But his companion grabbed the weapon and shoved down on it before it could be fired. This set off a violent argument between the two, and as they traded vociferous opinions in a language consisting mostly of consonants, the land speeder sped on its way. Either because the speeder had passed out of range, or because the second Tusken had convinced the other, the two broke off the discussion and scrambled down the back side of the high ridge. Snuffling and a shifting of weight took place at the ridge bottom as the two banthas stirred at the approach of their masters. Each was as large as a small dinosaur, with bright eyes and thick, long fur. They hissed anxiously as the two Sand People approached, then mounted them from knee to saddle. With a kick, banthas rose. Moving slowly, but with enormous strides, the two massive horned creatures swept down the back of the rugged bluff, urged on by their anxious, equally outrageous mahouts. "It's him, all right," Luke declared with mixed anger and satisfaction as the tiny tripodal form came into view. The speeder banked and swung down onto the floor of a huge sandstone canyon. Luke slipped his rifle out from behind the seat and swung it over his shoulder. "Come round in front of him, 3PO, he instructed. "With pleasure, sir." The R2 unit obviously noticed their approach, but made no move to escape. It could hardly have outrun the land speeder anyway. R2 simply halted as soon as it detected them and waited until the craft swung around in a smooth arc. 3PO came to a sharp halt, sending up a low cloud of sand on the smaller robot's right. Then the whine from the land speeder's engine dropped to a low idling hum as 3PO put it in parking mode. A last sigh and the craft stopped completely. After finishing a cautious survey of the canyon, Luke led his companion out onto the gravelly surface and up to R2-D2. "Just where," he inquired sharply, "did you think you were going?" A feeble whistle issued from the apologetic robot, but it was 3PO and not the recalcitrant rover who was abruptly doing most of the talking. "Master Luke here is now your rightful owner, R2. How could you just amble away from him like this? Now that he's found you, let's have no more of this Obi-Wan Kenobi gibberish. I don't know where you picked that up, or that melodramatic hologram either." R2 started to beep in protest, but 3PO's indignation was too great to permit excuses. "And don't talk to me about your mission. What rot! You're fortunate Master Luke doesn't blast you into a million pieces right here and now." Not much chance of that, admitted Luke, a bit overwhelmed by 3PO's casual vindictiveness. Come on, it's getting late. He eyed the rapidly rising suns. I just hope he can get back before Uncle Owen really lets go. If you don't mind my saying so, 3PO suggested, apparently unwilling that the R2 unit should get off so easily, I think you ought to deactivate the little fugitive until you've gotten him safely back in the garage. No, he's not going to try anything. Luke studied the softly beeping droid sternly. I hope he's learned his lesson. There's no need to. Without warning, the R2 unit suddenly leaped off the ground. No mean feat considering the weakness of the spring mechanisms in his 3 thick legs. His cylindrical body was twisting and spinning as he let out a frantic symphony of whistles, hoots, and electronic exclamations. Luke was tired, not alarmed. What is it? What's wrong with him now? He was beginning to see how 3PO's patience could be worn thin. He had had about enough of this addled instrument himself. Undoubtedly, the R2 unit had acquired the holo of the girl by accident, then used it to entice Luke into removing his restraining module. 3PO probably had the right attitude. Still, once Luke got its circuits realigned and its logic couplings cleaned, it would make a perfectly serviceable farm unit. Only, if that was the case, then why was 3PO looking around so anxiously? Oh my, sir, R2 claims there are several creatures of unknown type approaching from the southeast. That could be another attempt by R2 to distract them, but Luke couldn't take the chance. Instantly, he had his rifle off his shoulder and had activated the energy cell. He examined the horizon in the indicated direction and saw nothing. But then, sand people were experts at making themselves unseeable. Luke suddenly realized exactly how far out they were, how much ground the land speeder had covered that morning. I've never been out in this direction this far from the farm before, he informed 3PO. There are some awfully strange things living out here. Not all of them have been classified. It's better to treat anything as dangerous until determined otherwise. Of course, if it's something utterly new. His curiosity prodded him. In any case, this was probably just another ruse of R2-D2's. Let's take a look, he decided. Moving cautiously forward and keeping his rifle ready, he led 3PO toward the crest of a nearby high dune. At the same time, he took care not to let R2 out of his sight. Once at the top, he lay flat and traded his rifle for the macro binoculars. Below, another canyon spread out before them, rising to a wind-weathered wall of rust and ochre. Advancing the binocs slowly across the canyon floor, he settled unexpectedly on 2 tethered shapes, banthas, and riderless. Did you say something, sir? Wheezed 3PO, struggling up behind Luke. His locomotors were not designed for such outer climbing and scrambling. Banthas, all right, Luke whispered over his shoulder, not considering in the excitement of the moment that 3PO might not know a bantha from a panda. He looked back into the eyepieces, refocusing slightly. Wait, it's sand people, sure. I see one of them. Something dark suddenly blocked his sight. For a moment he thought that a rock might have moved in front of him. Irritably, he dropped the binoculars and reached out to move the blinding object aside. His hand touched something like soft metal. It was a bandaged leg about as big around as both of Luke's together. Shocked, he looked up. And up. The towering figure glaring down at him was no Jawa. It had seemingly erupted straight from the sand. 3PO took a startled step backward and found no footing. As gyros whined in protest, the tall robot tumbled backward down the side of the dune. Frozen in place, Luke heard steadily fading bangs and rattles as 3PO bounced down the steep slope behind him. As the moment of confrontation passed, the Tusken let out a terrifying grunt of fury and pleasure and brought down his heavy Gaddafi. The double-edged axe would have cleaved Luke's skull neatly in 2, except that he threw the rifle up in a gesture more instinctive than calculated. His weapon deflected the blow, but would never do so again. Made from cannibalized freighter plating, the huge axe shattered the barrel and made metallic confetti of the gun's delicate insides. Luke scrambled upward and found himself against a steep drop. The raider stalked him slowly, weapon held high over its rag-enclosed head. It uttered a gruesome, chuckling laugh. The sound made all the more inhumane by the distortion effect of its grid-like sand filter. Luke tried to view his situation objectively, as he had been instructed to do in survival school. Trouble was, his mouth was dry, his hands were shaking, and he was paralyzed with fear. With the raider in front of him and a probably fatal drop behind, something else in his mind took over and opted for the least painful response. He fainted. None of the raiders noticed R2-D2 as a tiny robot forced himself into a small alcove in the rocks near the land speeder. One of them was carrying the inert form of Luke.
He dumped the unconscious youth in a heap next to the speeder, then joined his fellows as they began swarming over the open craft. Supplies and spare parts were thrown in all directions. From time to time the plundering would be interrupted as several of them quibbled or fought over a particular choice bit of booty. Unexpectedly, distribution of the Landspeeder's contents ceased, and with frightening speed the raiders became part of the desertscape, looking in all directions. A lost breeze idled absently down the canyon. Far off to the west, something howled. A rolling, booming drone ricocheted off canyon walls and crawled nervously up and down a Gorgon scale. The sand people remained poised a moment longer. Then they were uttering loud grunts and moans of fright as they rushed to get away from the highly visible speeder. The shivering howl sounded again, nearer this time. By now the sand people were halfway to their waiting banthas, that were likewise lowing tensely and tugging at their tethers. Although the sound had no meaning for R2-D2, the little droid tried to squeeze himself even deeper into the almost cave. The booming howl came closer. Judging by the way the sand people had reacted, something monstrous beyond imagining had to be behind that rolling cry. Something monstrous and murder-bent, which might not have the sense to distinguish between edible organics and inedible machines. Not even the dust of their passing remained a mark where the Tusken Raiders had only minutes before been dismembering the interior of the Landspeeder. R2-D2 shut down all but vital functions, trying to minimize noise and light as a swishing sound grew gradually audible. Moving toward the Landspeeder, the creature appeared above the top of a nearby dune. 5. It was tall, but hardly monstrous. R2 frowned inwardly as he checked ocular circuitry and reactivated his innards. The monster looked very much like an old man. He was clad in a shabby cloak, and loose robes hung with a few small straps, packs, and unrecognizable instruments. R2 searched the human's wake, but detected no evidence of a pursuing nightmare. Nor did the man appear threatened. Actually, R2 thought, he looked kind of pleased. It was impossible to tell where the odd arrival's overlapping attire ended and his skin began. That aged visage blended into the sand-soaked cloak, and his beard appeared but an extension of the loose threads covering his upper chest. Hints of extreme climates other than desert, of ultimate cold and humidity, were etched into that seamed face. A questing beak of nose like a high rock protruded outward from a flesh flood of wrinkles and scars. The eyes bordering it were liquid crystal azure. The man smiled through sand and dust and beard, squinting at the sight of the crumpled form lying quietly alongside the Landspeeder. Convinced that the sand people had been the victims of an auditory delusion of some kind, conveniently ignoring the fact that he had experienced it also, and likewise assured that this stranger meant Luke no harm, R2 shifted his position slightly, trying to obtain a better view. The sound produced by a tiny pebble he dislodged was barely perceptible to his electronic sensors, but the man whirled as if shot. He stared straight at R2's alcove, still smiling gently. "Hello there," he called in a deep, surprisingly cheerful voice. "Come here, my little friend. No need to be afraid." Something forthright and reassuring was in that voice. In any case, the association of an unknown human was preferable to remaining isolated in this wasteland. Waddling out into the sunlight, R2 made his way over to where Luke lay sprawled. The robot's barrel-like body inclined forward as he examined the limp form. Whistles and beeps of concern came from within. Walking over, the old man bent beside Luke and reached out to touch his forehead, then his temple. Shortly, the unconscious youth was stirring and mumbling like a dreaming sleeper. "Don't worry," the human told R2. "You'll be all right." As if to confirm this opinion, Luke blinked, stared upward uncomprehendingly, and muttered, "What happened?" "Rest easy, son," the man instructed him as he sat back on his heels. "You've had a busy day." Again, the boyish grin. "You're mighty lucky your head's still attached to the rest of you." Luke looked around, his gaze coming to rest on the elderly face hovering above him. Recognition did wonders for his condition. "Ben! It's gotta be." A sudden remembrance made him look around fearfully, but there was no sign of sand people. Slowly, he raised his body to a sitting position. "Ben Kenobi, am I glad to see you." Rising, the old man surveyed the canyon floor and rolled rim wall above. One foot played with the sand. "The Junlin wastes are not to be traveled lightly. It's the misguided traveler who tempts the Tusken's hospitality." His gaze went back to his patient. "Tell me, young man, what brings you out this far into nowhere?" Luke indicated R2-D2. This little droid. For a while I thought he'd gone crazy, claiming he was searching for a former master. Now I don't think so. I've never seen such devotion in a droid, misguided or otherwise. There seems to be no stopping him. He even resorted to tricking me. Luke's gaze shifted upward. He claims to be the property of someone called Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke watched closely, but the man showed no reaction. Is that a relative of yours? My uncle thinks he was a real person. Or is it just some unimportant bit of scrambled information that got shifted into his primary performance bank? An introspective frown did remarkable things to that sandblasted face. Kenobi appeared to ponder the question, scratching absently at his scruffy beard. Obi-Wan Kenobi, he recited. Obi-Wan. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. A long time. Most curious. My uncle said he was dead, Luke supplied helpfully. Oh, he's not dead, Kenobi corrected him easily. Not yet, not yet. Luke climbed excitedly to his feet, all thoughts of Tusken Raiders forgotten now. You know him, then? A smile of perverse youthfulness split that collage of wrinkled skin and beard. Of course I know him. He's me. Just as you probably suspected, Luke. I haven't gone by the name Obi-Wan, though, since before you were born. Then, Luke essayed, gestured at R2-D2. This droid does belong to you, as he claims. Now that's the peculiar part, an openly puzzled Kenobi confessed, regarding the silent robot. I can't seem to remember owning a droid, least of all a modern R2 unit. Most interesting. Most interesting. Something drew the old man's gaze suddenly to the brow of nearby cliffs. I think it's best we make use of your land speeder some. The sandpeople are easily startled, but they'll soon return in greater numbers. The land speeder's not a prize readily conceded, and after all, Jawas they're not. Placing both hands over his mouth in a peculiar fashion, Kenobi inhaled deeply and let out an unearthly howl that made Luke jump. That ought to keep any laggards running for a while yet, the old man concluded with satisfaction. That's a crate dragging call, Luke gaped in astonishment. How did you do that? I'll show you sometime, son. It's not too hard. Just takes the right attitude, a set of well-used vocal cords, and a lot of wind. Now, if you were an imperial bureaucrat, I could teach you right off. But you're not. He scanned the cliff spine again, and I don't think this is the time or place for it. I won't argue that. Luke was rubbing at the back of his head. Let's get started. That was when R2 let out a pathetic beep and whirled. Luke couldn't interpret the electronic squeal, but he suddenly comprehended the reason behind it. 3PO. Luke exclaimed worriedly. R2 was already moving as fast as possible away from the land speeder. Come on, Ben. The little robot led them to the edge of a large sand pit. It stopped there, pointing downward and squeaking mournfully. Luke saw where R2 was pointing, then started cautiously down the smooth, shifting slope while Kenobi followed effortlessly. 3PO lay in the sand at the base of the slope down which he had rolled and tumbled. His casing was dented and badly mangled. One arm lay broken and bent a short distance away. 3PO, Luke called. There was no response. Shaking the droid failed to activate anything. Opening a plate on the robot's back, Luke flipped a hidden switch on and off several times in succession. A low hum started, stopped, started again, and then dropped to a normal purr. Using his remaining arm, 3PO rolled over and sat up. Where am I? He murmured, and his photoreceptors continued to clear. Then he recognized Luke. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I must have taken a bad step. You're lucky any of your main circuits are still operational, Luke informed him. He looked significantly toward the top of the hill. Can you stand? We've got to get out of here before the sand people return. Servo motors whined in protest until 3PO ceased struggling. I don't think I can make it. You go on, Master Luke. It doesn't make sense to risk yourself on my account. I'm finished. No, you're not, Luke shot back, unaccountably affected by his recently encountered machine. But then, 3PO was not the usual uncommunicative, agri-functional device Luke was accustomed to deal with. What kind of talk is that? Logical, 3PO informed him. Luke shook his head angrily. Defeatist. With Luke and Ben Kenobi's aid, the battered droid somehow managed to struggle erect. Little R2 watched from the pit's rim. Hesitating partway up the slope, Kenobi sniffed the air suspiciously. Quickly, son. They're on the move again. Trying to watch the surrounding rocks and his footsteps simultaneously, Luke fought to drag 3PO clear of the pit. The decor of Ben Kenobi's well-concealed cave was Spartan without appearing uncomfortable. It would not have suited most people, reflecting as it did its owner's peculiarly eclectic tastes. The living area radiated an aura of lean comfort with more importance attached to mental comforts than those of the awkward human body. They had succeeded in vacating the canyon before the Tusken Raiders could return in force. Under Kenobi's direction, Luke left a trail behind them so confusing that not even a hyper-nasal Jawa could have followed it. Luke spent several hours ignoring the temptations of Kenobi's cave. Instead, he remained in the corner, which was equipped as a compact yet complete repair shop, working to fix 3PO's severed arm. Fortunately, the automatic overload disconnects had given way under the severe strain, sealing electronic nerves and ganglia without real damage. Repair was merely a matter of reattaching the limb to the shoulder, then activating the self-free seals. Had the arm been broken in mid-bone instead of at a joint, such repairs would have been impossible save at a factory shop. While Luke was thus occupied, Kenobi's attention was concentrated on R2-D2. The squat droid sat passively on the cool cavern floor while the old man fiddled with its metal insides. Finally, the man sat back with a humph of satisfaction and closed the open panels on the robot's rounded head. Now let's see if we can figure out what you are, my little friend, and where you came from. Luke was almost finished anyway, and Kenobi's words were sufficient to pull him away from the repair area. I saw part of the message, he began, and I... Once more the striking portrait was being projected into empty space from the front of the little robot. Luke broke off, enraptured by its enigmatic beauty once again. Yes, I think that's got it, Kenobi murmured contemplatively. The image continued to flicker, indicating a tape hastily prepared. But it was much sharper, better defined now, Luke noted with admiration. One thing was apparent. Kenobi was skilled in subjects more specific than desert scavenging. General Obi-Wan Kenobi, the mellifluous voice was saying, I present myself in the name of the world family of Alderaan and the Alliance to restore the Republic. I break your solitude at the bidding of my father, Bail Organa, Viceroy and first chairman of the Alderaan system. Kenobi absorbed this extraordinary declamation, while Luke's eyes bugged big enough to fall from his face. Years ago, General, the voice continued, you served the old Republic in the Clone Wars. Now my father begs you to aid us again in our most desperate hour. He would have you join him on Alderaan. You must go to him. I regret that I am unable to present my father's request to you in person. My mission to meet personally with you has failed. Hence, I have been forced to resort to the secondary method of communication. Information vital to the survival of the Alliance has been secured in the mind of this D2 droid. My father will know how to retrieve it. I plead with you to see this unit safely delivered to Alderaan. She paused, and when she continued, her words were hurried and less laced with formality. You must help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You are my last hope. I will be captured by agents of the Empire. They will learn nothing from me. Everything to be learned lies locked in the memory cells of this droid. Do not fail us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Do not fail me. A small cloud of tri-dimensional static replaced the delicate portrait. Then it vanished entirely. R2-D2 gazed up expectantly at Kenobi. Luke's mind was as muddy as a pond laced with petroleum. Unanchored, his thoughts and eyes turned for stability to the quiet figure seated nearby. The old man. The crazy wizard. The desert bum and all-around character whom his uncle and everyone else had known for as long as Luke could recall. If the breathless, anxiety-written message the unknown woman had just spoken into the air of the cave had affected Kenobi in any way, he gave no hint of it. Instead, he leaned back against the rock wall and tugged thoughtfully at his beard, puffing slowly on a water pipe of free-form tarnished chrome. Luke visualized that simple yet lovely portrait. She's so... His farming background didn't provide him with the requisite words. Suddenly, something in the message caused him to stare disbelievingly at the oldster. General Kenobi, you fought in the Clone Wars? But that was so long ago. Yes, Kenobi acknowledged, as casually as he might have been discussing the recipe for Shang stew. I guess it was a while back. I was a Jedi Knight once. Like, he added, watching the youth appraisingly, your father. A Jedi Knight, Luke echoed. Then he looked confused. But my father didn't fight in the Clone Wars. He was no knight, just a navigator on a spice freighter. Kenobi's smile enfolded the pipe's mouthpiece. Or so your uncle has told you. His attention was suddenly focused elsewhere. Owen Lars didn't agree with your father's ideas, opinions, or his philosophy of life. He believed that your father should have stayed here on Tatooine and not gotten involved. Again, the seemingly indifferent shrug. Well, he thought he should have remained here and minded his farming. Luke said nothing, his body tense as the old man related bits and pieces of a personal history Luke had viewed only through his uncle's distortions. Owen was always afraid that your father's adventurous life might influence you, might pull you away from Anchorhead. He shook his head slowly, regretfully at the remembrance. I'm afraid there wasn't much of the farmer in your father. Luke turned away. He returned to cleaning the last particles of sand from 3PO's healing armature. I wish I'd known him, he finally whispered. He was the best pilot I ever knew, Kenobi went on, and a smart fighter. The Force. The instinct was strong in him. For a brief second, Kenobi actually appeared old. He was also a good friend. Suddenly, the boyish twinkle returned to those piercing eyes, along with the old man's natural humor. I understand you're quite a pilot yourself. Piloting and navigation aren't hereditary, but a number of the things that can combine to make a good small ship pilot are. Those you may have inherited. Still, even a duck has to be taught to swim. What's a duck? Luke asked curiously. Never mind. In many ways, you know, you're much like your father. Kenobi's unabashed look of evaluation made Luke nervous. You've grown up quite a bit since the last time I saw you. Having no reply for that, Luke waited silently as Kenobi sank deep into contemplation. After a while, the old man stirred, evidently having reached an important decision. All this reminds me, he declared with deceptive casualness. I have something here for you. He rose and walked over to a bulky, old-fashioned chest and started rummaging through it. All sorts of intriguing items were removed and shoved around, only to be placed back in the bin. A few of them Luke recognized. As Kenobi was obviously intent on something important, he forebore inquiring about any of the other tantalizing flotsam. When you were old enough, Kenobi was saying, your father wanted you to have this. If I can even find the blasted device. I tried to give it to you once before, but your uncle wouldn't allow it. He believed you might get some crazy ideas from it and end up following old Obi-Wan on some idealistic crusade. You see, Luke, that's where your father and your Uncle Owen disagreed. Lars is not a man to let idealism interfere with business, whereas your father didn't think the question even worth discussing. His decision on such matters came like his piloting. Instinctively. Luke nodded. He finished picking out the last of the grit and looked around for one remaining component to snap back into 3PO's open chest plate. Locating the restraining module, he opened the receiving latches in the machine and set about locking it back in place. 3PO watched the process and appeared to wince ever so perceptibly. Luke stared into those metal and plastic photoreceptors for a long moment. Then he set the module pointedly on the workbench and closed the droid up. 3PO said nothing. A grunt came from behind him, and Luke turned to see a pleased Kenobi walking over. He handed Luke a small, innocuous-looking device, which the youth studied with interest. It consisted primarily of a short, thick hand grip with a couple of small switches set into the grip. Above this small post was a circular metal disc barely larger in diameter than his spread palm. A number of unfamiliar jewel-like components were built into both handle and disc, including what looked like the smallest power cell Luke had ever seen. The reverse side of the disc was polished to a mirror brightness, but it was the power cell that puzzled Luke the most. Whatever the thing was, it required a great deal of energy according to the rating form of the cell. Despite the claim that it had belonged to his father, the gizmo looked newly manufactured. Kenobi had obviously kept it carefully. Only a number of minute scratches on the hand grip hinted at previous usage. "Sir?" came a familiar voice Luke hadn't heard in a while. "What?" Luke was startled out of his examination. "If you'll not be needing me," 3PO declared, "I think I'll shut down for a bit. It will help the armature nerves to knit, and I'm due for some internal self-cleansing anyhow." "Sure, go ahead," Luke said absently, returning to his fascinated study of the whatever it was. Behind him, 3PO became silent, the glow fading temporarily from his eyes. Luke noticed that Kenobi was watching him with interest. "What is it?" he finally asked, unable, despite his best efforts, to identify the device. "Your father's lightsaber," Kenobi told him. "At one time they were widely used. Still are in certain galactic quarters." Luke examined the controls on the handle, then tentatively touched a brightly colored button up near the mirrored pommel. Instantly the disc put forth a blue-white beam as thick around as his thumb. It was dense to the point of opacity, and a little over a meter in length. It did not fade, but remained as brilliant and intense at its far end as it did next to the disc. Strangely, Luke could feel no heat from it, though he was very careful not to touch it. He knew what a lightsaber could do, though he had never seen one before. It could drill a hole right through the rock wall of Kenobi's cave, or through a human being. This was the formal weapon of a Jedi Knight, explained Kenobi, not as clumsy or random as a blaster. More skill than simple sight was required for its use. An elegant weapon. It was a symbol as well. Anyone can use a blaster or fusion cutter, but to use a lightsaber well was the mark of someone a cut above the ordinary. He was pacing the floor of the cave as he spoke. For over 1,000 generations, Luke, the Jedi Knights were the most powerful, most respected force in the galaxy. They served as the guardians and guarantors of peace and justice in the Old Republic. When Luke failed to ask what had happened to them since, Kenobi looked up to see that the youth was staring vacantly into space, having absorbed little, if any, of the oldster's instruction. Some men would have chided Luke for not paying attention. Not Kenobi. More sensitive than most, he waited patiently until the silence weighed strong enough on Luke for him to resume speaking. "How," he asked slowly, "did my father die?" Kenobi hesitated, and Luke sensed that the old man had no wish to talk about this particular matter. Unlike Uncle Owen, however, Kenobi was unable to take refuge in a comfortable lie. "He was betrayed and murdered," Kenobi declared solemnly, "by a very young Jedi named Darth Vader. He was not looking at Luke, a boy I was training, one of my brightest disciples, one of my greatest failures." Kenobi resumed his pacing. "Vader used the training I gave him and the force within him for evil, to help the later corrupt emperors. With the Jedi Knights disbanded, disorganized, or dead, there were few to oppose Vader. Today they are all but extinct." An indecipherable expression crossed Kenobi's face. In many ways they were too good, too trusting for their own health. They put too much trust in the stability of the Republic, failing to realize that while the body might be sound, the head was growing diseased and feeble, leaving it open to manipulation by such as the Emperor. I wish I knew what Vader was after. Sometimes I have the feeling he is marking time in preparation for some incomprehensible abomination, such as the destiny of one who masters the Force and is consumed by its dark side. Luke's face twisted in confusion. "A force? That's the second time you've mentioned a force." Kenobi nodded. "I forget sometimes in whose presence I babble. Let us say simply that the Force is something a Jedi must deal with. While it has never been properly explained, scientists have theorized it is an energy field generated by living things. Early man suspected its existence, yet remained in ignorance of its potential for millennia. Only certain individuals could recognize the Force for what it was. They were mercilessly labeled charlatans, fakers, mystics, and worse. Even fewer could make use of it. As it was usually beyond their primitive controls, it frequently was too powerful for them. They were misunderstood by their fellows. And worse." Kenobi made a wide, all-encompassing gesture with both arms. "The Force surrounds each and every one of us. Some men believe it directs their actions and not the other way around. Knowledge of the Force and how to manipulate it was what gave the Jedi his special power." The arms came down and Kenobi stared at Luke until the youth began to fidget uncomfortably. When he spoke again, it was in a tone so crisp and unaged that Luke jumped in spite of himself. "You must learn the ways of the Force also, Luke, if you are to come with me to Alderaan." "Alderaan?" Luke hopped off the repair seat, looking dazed. "I'm not going to Alderaan. I don't even know where Alderaan is." Vaporators, droids, harvest, abruptly the surroundings seemed to close in on him, the formerly intriguing furnishings and alien artifacts now just a mite frightening. He looked around wildly, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of Ben Kenobi. Old Ben. Crazy Ben. General Obi-Wan. "I've got to get back home," he found himself muttering thickly. "It's late. I'm in for it as it is." Remembering something, he gestured toward the motionless bulk of R2-D2. "You can keep the droid. He seems to want you to. I'll think of something to tell my uncle. I hope," he added forlornly. "I need your help, Luke," Kenobi explained, his manner a combination of sadness and steel. "I'm getting too old for this kind of thing. Can't trust myself to finish it properly on my own. This mission is far too important." He nodded toward R2-D2. "You heard and saw the message." "But I can't get involved with anything like that," protested Luke. "I've got work to do. We've got crops to bring in. Even though Uncle Owen could always break down and hire a little extra help. I mean, one, I guess. But there's nothing I can do about it. Not now. Besides, that's all such a long way from here. The whole thing's really none of my business." "That sounds like your uncle talking," Kenobi observed without rancor. "Oh, my Uncle Owen. How am I going to explain all this to him?" The old man suppressed a smile, aware that Luke's destiny had already been determined for him. It had been ordained 5 minutes before he had learned about the manner of his father's death. It had been ordered before that when he had heard the complete message. It had been fixed in the nature of things when he had first viewed the pleading portrait of the beautiful Senator Organa, awkwardly projected by the little droid. Kenobi shrugged inwardly. Likely it had been finalized even before the boy was born. Not that Ben believed in predestination, but he did believe in heredity, and in the Force. Remember, Luke, the suffering of one man is the suffering of all. Distances are irrelevant to injustice. If not stopped soon enough, evil eventually reaches out to engulf all men, whether they have opposed it or ignored it. I suppose, Luke confessed nervously, I could take you as far as Anchorhead. You can get transport from there to Mos Eisley, or wherever it is you want to go. Very well, agreed Kenobi. That will do for a beginning. Then you must do what you feel is right. Luke turned away, now thoroughly confused. Okay. Right now I don't feel too good. The holding hole was deathly dim, with only the bare minimum of illumination provided. There was barely enough to see the black metal walls and the high ceiling overhead. The cell was designed to maximize a prisoner's feelings of helplessness, and this it achieved well. So much so that the single occupant started tensely as a hum came from one end of the chamber. The metal door which began moving aside was as thick as her body. As if, she mused bitterly, they were afraid she might break through anything less massive with her bare hands. Straining to see outside, the girl saw several Imperial guards assume positions just outside the doorway. Eyeing them defiantly, Leia Organa backed up against the far wall. Her determined expression collapsed as soon as a monstrous black form entered the room, gliding smoothly as if on treads. Vader's presence crushed her spirit as thoroughly as an elephant would crush an eggshell. That villain was followed by an antiquated whip of a man, who was only slightly less terrifying, despite his minuscule appearance alongside the Dark Lord. Darth Vader made a gesture to someone outside. Something that hummed like a huge bee moved close and slipped inside the doorway. Leia choked on her own breath at the sight of the dark metal globe. It hung suspended on independent repulsors, a farrago of metal arms protruding from its sides. The arms were tipped with a multitude of delicate instruments. Leia studied the contraption fearfully. She had heard rumors of such machines, but had never really believed that Imperial technicians would construct such a monstrosity. Incorporated into its soulless memory was every barbarity, every substantiated outrage known to mankind, and to several alien races as well. Vader and Tarkin stood there quietly, giving her plenty of time to study the hovering nightmare. The governor, in particular, did not delude himself into thinking that the mere presence of the device would shock her into giving up the information he needed. Not, he reflected, that the ensuing session would be especially unpleasant. There was always enlightenment and knowledge to be gained from such encounters, and the senator promised to be a most interesting subject. After a suitable interval had passed, he motioned to the machine. Now, Senator Organa, Princess Organa, we will discuss the location of the principal rebel base. The machine moved slowly toward her, traveling on a rising hum. Its indifferent spherical form blocked out Vader, the governor, the rest of the cell, the light. Muffled sounds penetrated the cell walls and thick door, drifting out into the hallway beyond. They barely intruded on the peace and quiet of the walkway running past the sealed chamber. Even so, the guards stationed immediately outside managed to find excuses to edge a sufficient distance away to where those oddly modulated sounds could no longer be heard at all. 6. Look over there, Luke, Kenobi ordered, pointing to the southwest. The land speeder continued to race over the gravelly desert floor beneath them. Smoke, I should think. Luke spared a glance at the indicated direction. I don't see anything, sir. Let's angle over that way anyhow. Someone may be in trouble. Luke turned the speeder. Before long, the rising wisps of smoke that Kenobi had somehow detected earlier became visible to him also. Topping a slight rise, the speeder dropped down a gentle slope into a broad, shallow canyon that was filled with twisted, burned shapes, some of them inorganic, some not. Dead in the center of this carnage, and looking like a beached metal whale, lay the shattered hulk of a Jawa sandcrawler. Luke brought the speeder to a halt. Kenobi followed him onto the sand, and together they began to examine the detritus of destruction. Several slight depressions in the sand caught Luke's attention. Walking a little faster, he came up next to them and studied them for a moment before calling back to Kenobi. "Looks like the sand people did it all right. Here's bantha tracks." Luke noticed a gleam of metal half buried in the sand. "And there's a piece of one of those big double axes of theirs." He shook his head in confusion. "But I never heard of the raiders hitting something this big." He leaned back, staring up at the towering, burned-out bulk of the sandcrawler. Kenobi had passed him. He was examining the broad, huge footprints in the sand. "They didn't," he declared casually, "but they intended that we, and anyone else who might happen onto this, should think so." Luke moved up alongside him. "I don't understand, sir." "Look at these tracks carefully," the older man directed him, pointing down at the nearest and then up at the others. "Notice anything funny about them?" Luke shook his head. "Whoever left here was riding banthas side by side. Sand people always ride bantha one behind the other, single file, to hide their strength from any distant observers." Leaving Luke to gape at the parallel sets of tracks, Kenobi turned his attention to the sandcrawler. He pointed out where single weapons bursts had blasted away portals, treads, and support beams. "Look at the precision with which this firepower was applied. Sand people aren't this accurate. In fact, no one on Tatooine fires and destroys with this kind of efficiency." Turning, he examined the horizon. One of those nearby bluffs concealed a secret, and a threat. Only Imperial troops would mount an attack on a sandcrawler with this kind of cold accuracy. Luke had walked over to one of the small, crumpled bodies and kicked it over onto its back. His face screwed up in distaste as he saw what remained of the pitiful creature. "These are the same Jawas who sold Uncle Owen and me R2 and 3PO. I recognize this one's cloak design. Why would Imperial troops be slaughtering Jawas and sand people? They must have killed some raiders to get those banthas." His mind worked furiously, and he found himself growing unnaturally tense as he stared back at the land speeder, past the rapidly deteriorating corpses of the Jawas. But if they tracked the droids to the Jawas, then they had to learn first who had sold them to. That would lead them back to... Luke was sprinting insanely for the land speeder. "Luke, wait! Wait, Luke!" Kenobi called. "It's too dangerous. You'd never—" Luke heard nothing except the roaring in his ears, felt nothing save the burning in his heart. He jumped into the speeder and was throwing the accelerator full over almost simultaneously. In an explosion of sand and gravel, he left Kenobi and the two robots standing alone in the midst of smoldering bodies, framed by the still smoking wreck of the sandcrawler. The smoke that Luke saw as he drew near the homestead was of a different consistency from that which had boiled out of the Jawa machine. He barely remembered to shut down the land speeder's engine as he popped the cockpit canopy and threw himself out. Dark smoke was drifting steadily from holes in the ground. Those holes had been his home, the only one he had ever known. They might as well have been throats of small volcanoes now. Again and again he tried to penetrate the surface entrances to the below-ground complex. Again and again the still intense heat drove him back, coughing and choking. Weakly he found himself stumbling clear, his eyes watering not entirely from the smoke. Half blinded, he staggered over to the exterior entrance to the garage. It, too, was burning. But perhaps they managed to escape in the other land speeder. "Aunt Beru! Uncle Owen!" It was difficult to make out much of anything through the eye-stinging haze. Two smoking shapes showed down the tunnel, barely visible through tears and haze. They almost looked like... He squinted harder, wiping angrily at his uncooperative eyes. No. Then he was spinning away, falling to his stomach and burying his face in the sand so he wouldn't have to look any more. The tri-dimensional solid screen filled one wall of the vast chamber from floor to ceiling. It showed 1,000,000 star systems. A tiny portion of the galaxy, but an impressive display nonetheless when exhibited in such a fashion. Below, far below, the huge shape of Darth Vader stood flanked on one side by Governor Tarkin, and on the other by Admiral Motti and General Tagg, their private antagonisms forgotten in the awesomeness of this moment. "The final checkout is complete," Motti informed them. "All systems are operational." He turned to the others. "What shall be the first course we set?" Vader appeared not to have heard as he mumbled softly, half to himself. "She has a surprising amount of control. Her resistance to the interrogator is considerable." He glanced down at Tarkin.
It will be some time before we can extract any useful information from her. I've always found the methods you recommend rather quaint, Vader. They are efficient, the Dark Lord argued softly. In the interest of accelerating the procedure, however, I am open to your suggestions. Tarkin looked thoughtful. Such stubbornness can often be detoured by applying threats to something other than the one involved. What do you mean? Only that I think it is time we demonstrated the full power of this station. We may do so in a fashion doubly useful. He instructed the attentive Maudie. Tell your programmers to set course for the Alderaan system. Kenobi's pride did not prevent him from wrapping an old scarf over nose and mouth to filter out a portion of the bonfire's drifting putrid odor. Though possessed of olfactory sensory apparatus, R2-D2 and 3PO had no need of such a screen. Even 3PO, who was equipped to discriminate among aroma aesthetics, could be artificially selective when he so desired. Working together, the two droids helped Kenobi throw the last of the bodies onto the blazing pyre, then stood back and watched the dead continue to burn. Not that the desert scavengers wouldn't have been equally efficient in picking the burned-out sandcrawler clean of flesh, but Kenobi retained values most modern men would have deemed archaic. He would consign no one to the bone gnawers and gravel maggots, not even a filthy Jawa. At a rising thrum, Kenobi turned from the residue of the noisome business to see the land speeder approaching, now traveling at a sensible pace, far different from when it had left. It slowed and hovered nearby, but showed no signs of life. Gesturing for the two robots to follow, Ben started toward the waiting craft. The canopy flipped open and up to reveal Luke sitting motionless in the pilot's seat. He didn't look up at Kenobi's inquiring glance. That in itself was enough to tell the old man what had happened. I share your sorrow, Luke, he finally ventured softly. There was nothing you could have done. Had you been there, you'd be dead now too, and the droids would be in the hands of the Imperials. Not even the Force. Damn your Force! Luke snarled with sudden violence. Then he turned and glared at Kenobi. There was a set to his jaw that belonged on a much older face. I'll take you to the spaceport at Mos Eisley, Ben. I want to go with you. To Alderaan. There's nothing left for me here now. His eyes turned to look out across the desert, to focus on something beyond sand and rock and canyon walls. I want to learn to be like a Jedi like my father. I want... He paused, the words backing up like a logjam in his throat. Kenobi slid into the cockpit, put a hand gently on the youth's shoulder, then went forward to make room for the two robots. I'll do my best to see that you get what you want, Luke. For now, let's go to Mos Eisley. Luke nodded and closed the canopy. The land speeder moved away to the southeast, leaving behind the still smoldering sandcrawler, the Jawa funeral pyre, and the only life Luke had ever known. Leaving the speeder parked near the edge of the sandstone bluff, Luke and Ben walked over and peered down at the tiny regularized bumps erupting from the sand-baked plain below. The haphazard collage of low-grade concrete, stone, and plastoid structures spread outward like a central power and water distribution plant, like the spokes of a wheel. Actually, the town was considerably larger than it appeared, since a good portion of it lay underground. Looking like bomb craters from this distance, the smooth circular depressions of launch stations pockmarked the cityscape. A brisk gale was scouring the tired ground. It whipped the sand around Luke's feet and legs as he adjusted his protective goggles. There it is, Kenobi murmured, indicating the unimpressive collection of buildings. Mos Eisley Spaceport, the ideal place for us to lose ourselves while we seek passage off-planet. Not a more wretched collection of villainy and disreputable types exists anywhere on Tatooine. The Empire has been alerted to us, so we must be very cautious, Luke. The population of Mos Eisley should disguise us well. Luke wore a determined look. I'm ready for anything, Obi-Wan. I wonder if you comprehend what that might entail, Luke, Kenobi thought, but he only nodded as he led the way back to the land speeder. Unlike Anchorhead, there were enough people in Mos Eisley to require movement in the heat of day. Built from the beginning with commerce in mind, even the oldest of the town's buildings had been designed to provide protection from the twin suns. They looked primitive from the outside, and many were, but oftentimes walls and arches of old stone masked Durasteel double walls with circulating coolant flowing freely between. Luke was maneuvering the land speeder through the town's outskirts when several tall, gleaming forms appeared from nowhere and began to close a circle around him. For one panicked moment, he considered gunning the engine and racing through the pedestrians and other vehicles. A startlingly firm grip on his arm both restrained and relaxed him. He glanced over to see Kenobi smiling, warning him. So they continued at a normal town cruising speed, Luke hoping that the Imperial troops were bent on business elsewhere. No such luck. One of the troopers raised an armored hand. Luke had no choice but to respond. As he pulled the land speeder over, he grew aware of the attention they were receiving from curious passerby. Worse yet, it seemed that the trooper's attention was in fact reserved not for Kenobi or himself, but for the two unmoving robots seated in the speeder behind him. "How long have you had these droids?" The trooper who had raised his hand barked. Polite formalities would be dispensed with, it appeared. Looking blank for a second, Luke finally came up with, 3 or 4 seasons, I guess. "They're for sale if you want them, and the price is right," Kenobi put in, giving a wonderful impression of a desert finagler out to cajole a few quick credits from ignorant Imperials. The trooper in charge did not deign to reply. He was absorbed in a thorough examination of the Landspeeder's underside. "Did you come in from the south?" he asked. No, Luke answered quickly. "We live in the west, near Bestine Township." "Bestine," the trooper murmured, walking around to study the speeder's front. Luke forced himself to stare straight ahead. Finally, the armored figure concluded his examination. He moved to stand ominously close to Luke and snapped, "Let me see your identification." Surely the man sensed his terror and nervousness by now, Luke thought wildly. His resolution of not long before to be ready to take on anything had already disintegrated under the unwinking stare of this professional soldier. He knew what would happen if they got a look at his formal ID, with the location of his homestead and the names of his nearest relatives on it. Something seemed to be buzzing inside his head. He felt faint. Kenobi had leaned over and was talking easily to the trooper. "You don't need to see our identification," the old man informed the Imperial in an extremely peculiar voice. Staring blankly back at him, the officer replied as if it were self-evident, "I don't need to see your identification." His reaction was the opposite of Kenobi's. His voice was normal, but his expression peculiar. "These aren't the droids you're looking for," Kenobi told him pleasantly. "These aren't the droids we're looking for." "He can go about his business." "You can go about your business," the metal-masked officer informed Luke. The expression of relief that spread across Luke's face ought to have been as revealing as his previous nervousness, but the Imperial ignored it. "Move along," Kenobi whispered. "Move along," the officer instructed Luke. Unable to decide whether he should salute, nod, or give thanks to the man, Luke settled for nudging the accelerator. The landspeeder moved forward, drawing away from the circle of troops. As they prepared to round a corner, Luke risked a glance backward. The officer who had inspected them appeared to be arguing with several comrades, though at this distance Luke couldn't be sure. He peered up at his tall companion and started to say something. Kenobi only shook his head slowly and smiled. Swallowing his curiosity, Luke concentrated on guiding the speeder through steadily narrowing streets. Kenobi seemed to have some idea where they were headed. Luke studied the rundown structures and equally unwholesome-looking individuals they were passing. They had entered the oldest section of Mos Eisley, and consequently the one where the old vices flourished most strongly. Kenobi pointed and Luke pulled the landspeeder up in front of what appeared to be one of the original spaceport's first blockhouses. It had been converted into a cantina whose clientele was suggested by the diverse nature of transport parked outside. Some of them Luke recognized, others he had only heard rumors of. The cantina itself, he knew from the design of the building, must lie partially underground. As the dusty but still sleek craft pulled into an open spot, a Jawa materialized from nowhere and began running covetous hands over the metal sides. Luke leaned out and barked something harsh at the subhuman, which caused it to scurry away. "I can't abide those Jawas," murmured 3PO with lofty disdain. "Disgusting creatures." Luke's mind was too full of their narrow escape for him to comment on 3PO's sentiments. "I still can't understand how we got by those troops. I thought we were as good as dead." "The Force is in the mind, Luke, and can sometimes be used to influence others. It's a powerful ally, but as you come to know the Force, you will discover it can also be a danger." Nodding without really understanding, Luke indicated the run-down, though obviously popular cantina. "Do you really think we can find a pilot here capable of taking us all the way to Alderaan?" Kenobi was exiting from the speeder. "Most of the good independent freighter pilots frequent this place, though many can afford better. They can talk freely here. You should have learned by now, Luke, not to equate ability with appearance." Luke saw the old man's shabby clothing anew and felt ashamed. "Watch yourself, though. This place can be rough." Luke found himself squinting as they entered the cantina. It was darker inside than he would have liked. Perhaps the regular habitués of this place were unaccustomed to the light of day, or didn't wish to be seen clearly. It didn't occur to Luke that the dim interior in combination with the brilliantly lit entrance permitted everyone inside to see each newcomer before he could see them. Moving inward, Luke was astonished at the variety of beings making use of the bar. There were one-eyed creatures and thousand-eyed creatures, with scales, creatures with fur, and some with skin that seemed to ripple and change consistency according to their feelings of the moment. Hovering near the bar itself was a towering insectoid that Luke glimpsed only as a threatening shadow. It contrasted with two of the tallest women Luke had ever seen. They were among the most normal-looking of the outrageous assemblage of humans that mixed freely among alien counterparts. Tentacles, claws, and hands were wrapped around drinking utensils of various sizes and shapes. Conversation was a steady babble of human and alien tongues. Leaning close, Kenobi gestured toward the far end of the bar. A small knot of rough-looking humans lounged there, drinking and laughing and trading stories of dubious origin. Corellians. Pirates, most likely. I thought we were looking for an independent freighter captain with his own ship for hire, Luke whispered back. So we are, young Luke. So we are, agreed Kenobi, and there's bound to be one or two adequate for our needs among that group. It's just that in Corellian terminology, the distinction between who owns what cargo tends to get a little muddled from time to time. Wait here. Luke nodded and watched as Kenobi worked his way through the crowd. The Corellian's suspicion at his approach vanished as soon as he engaged them in conversation. Something grabbed Luke's shoulder and spun him around. Hey! Looking around and struggling to regain his composure, he found himself staring up at an enormous, scruffy-looking human. Luke saw by the man's clothing that he must be the bartender, if not the owner of this cantina. We don't serve their kind in here, the glaring form growled. What? Luke replied dumbly. He still hadn't recovered from his sudden submergence into the cultures of several dozen races. It was rather different from the pool room behind the Anchorhead power station. You're droids, the bartender explained impatiently, gesturing with a thick thumb. Luke peered in the indicated direction to see R2 and 3PO standing quietly nearby. We'll have to wait outside. We don't serve them in here. I only carry stuff for organics, not, he concluded with an expression of distaste, mechanicals. Luke didn't like the idea of kicking 3PO and R2 out, but he didn't know how else to deal with the problem. The bartender didn't appear to be the sort who would readily respond to reason, and when he looked around for old Ben, Luke saw that he was locked in deep conversation with one of the Corellians. Meanwhile, the discussion had attracted the attention of several especially gruesome-looking types who happened to be clustered within hearing range. All were regarding Luke and the two droids in a decidedly unfriendly fashion. Yes, of course, Luke said, realizing this wasn't the time or place to force the issue of droid rights. I'm sorry. He looked over at 3PO. You better stay outside with the speeder. We don't want any trouble in here. I heartily agree with you, sir, 3PO said, his gaze traveling past Luke and the bartender to take in the unfriendly stares at the bar. I don't feel the need for lubrication at the moment anyway. With R2 waddling in his wake, the tall robot hastily headed for the exit. That finished things as far as the bartender was concerned, but Luke now found himself the subject of some unwanted attention. He abruptly became aware of his isolation and felt as if at one time or another every eye in the place rested a moment on him, that things human and otherwise were smirking and making comments about him behind his back. Trying to maintain an air of quiet confidence, he returned his gaze to old Ben and stared when he saw what the oldster was talking to now. The Corellian was gone. In its place, Kenobi was chatting with a towering anthropoid that showed a mouthful of teeth when it smiled. Luke had heard about Wookiees, but he had never expected to see one, much less meet one. Despite an almost comical quasi-monkey face, the Wookiee was anything but gentle-looking. Only the large, glowing yellow eyes softened its otherwise awesome appearance. The massive torso was covered entirely with soft, thick, russet fur. Less appealing cover consisted of a pair of chromed bandoliers, which held lethal projectiles of a type unknown to Luke. Other than these, the Wookiees wore little. Not, Luke knew, that anyone would laugh at the creature's mode of dress. He saw that other denizens of the bar eddied and swirled around the huge form without ever coming too close. All but old Ben, who was talking to the Wookiee in its own language, quarreling, and hooting softly like a native. In the course of the conversation, the old man had occasion to gesture in Luke's direction. Once the huge anthropoid stared directly at Luke and let out a horrifying, howling laugh. Disgruntled by the role he was evidently playing in the discussion, Luke turned away and pretended to ignore the whole conversation. He might be acting unfairly toward the creature, but he doubted that spine-quaking laugh was meant in gentle good fellowship. For the life of him, he couldn't understand what Ben wanted with the monster, or why he was spending his time in guttural conversation with it instead of with the now vanished Corellians. So he sat and sipped his drink in splendid silence, his eyes roving over the crowd in hopes of meeting a responsive gaze that held no belligerence. Suddenly, something shoved him roughly from behind so hard he almost fell. He turned angrily, but his fury spent itself in astonishment. He found himself confronted by a large squarish monstrosity of multiple eyes and indeterminate origin. Nagola Dawagi Bluedaga? The apparition bubbled challengingly. Luke had never seen its like before. He knew neither its species nor its language. The gabbling might have been an invitation to a fight, a request to share a drink, or a marriage proposal. Despite his ignorance, however, Luke could tell by the way the creature bobbed and wove unsteadily on its podal supports that it was imbibed too much of whatever it had considered a pleasing intoxicant. Not knowing what else to do, Luke tried turning back to his drink while studiously ignoring the creature. As he did so, a thing, a cross between a capybara and a small baboon, bounced over to stand, or squat, next to the quivering many-eye. A short, grubby-looking human also approached and put a companionable arm around the snuffling mass. "He doesn't like you," the stubby human informed Luke in a surprisingly deep voice. "I'm sorry about that," Luke admitted, wishing heartily he were somewhere else. "I don't like you either," the smiling little man went on with brotherly negativity. "I said I was sorry about it." Whether from the conversation it was having with the rodent-like creature or the overdose of booze, the apartment house for wayward eyeballs was obviously growing agitated. It leaned forward, almost toppling into Luke, and spewed a stream of unintelligible gibberish at him. Luke felt the eyes of the crowd on him as he grew increasingly more nervous. "Sorry," the human mimicked derisively, clearly deep into his own cups. "Are you insulting us? You just better watch yourself. We're all wanted." He indicated his drunken companions. "I have the death sentence on me in 12 different systems." "I'll be careful, then," Luke muttered. The little man was smiling broadly. "You'll be dead." At this, the rodent let out a loud grunt. It was either a signal or a warning, because everything human or otherwise which had been leaning up at the bar immediately backed away, leaving a clear space around Luke and his antagonists. Trying to salvage the situation, Luke essayed a wan smile. That faded rapidly when he saw that the three were readying hand weapons. Not only couldn't he have encountered all three of them, he had no idea what a couple of the lethal-looking devices did. "This little one isn't worth the trouble," a calm voice said. Luke looked up, startled. He hadn't heard Kenobi come up alongside him. "Come, let me buy you all something." By way of reply, the bulky monster chittered hideously and swung out a massive limb. It caught an unprepared Luke across the temple and sent him spinning across the room, crashing through tables and shattering a large jug filled with foul-smelling liquid. The crowd edged back farther, a few grunts and warning snorts coming from some of them, as the drunken monstrosity pulled a wicked-looking pistol from its service pouch. He started to wave it in Kenobi's direction. That spurred the heretofore neutral bartender to life. He came charging clumsily around the end of the bar, waving his hands frantically but still taking care to stay out of range. "No blasters, no blasters. Not in my place." The rodent thing chattered threateningly at him, while the weapon-wielding many-eyed spared him a warning grunt. In the split second when the gun and its owner's attention was off him, the old man's hand had moved to the disc slung at his side. The short human started to yell as a fiery blue-white light appeared in the dimness of the cantina. He never finished the yell. It turned into a blink. When the blink was finished, the man found himself lying prone against the bar, moaning and whimpering as he stared at the stump of an arm. In between the start of his yell and the conclusion of the blink, the rodent thing had been cleft cleanly in half down the middle, its two halves falling in opposite directions. The giant, multi-ocular creature still stood staring, dazed, at the old human who was posed motionless before it, the shining lightsaber held over his head in a peculiar fashion. The creature's chrome pistol fired once, blowing a hole in the door. Then the torso peeled away as neatly as had the body of the rodent, its two cauterized sections falling in opposite directions to lie motionless on the cool stone.
Only then did the suggestion of a sigh escape from Kenobi. Only then did his body appear to relax. Bringing the lightsaber down, he flipped it carefully upward in a reflex saluting motion, which ended with the deactivated weapon resting innocuously at his hip. That final movement broke the total quiet which had enshrouded the room. Conversation resumed, as did the movement of bodies in chairs, the scraping of mugs and pitchers and other drinking devices on tabletops. The bartender and several assistants appeared to drag the unsightly corpses out of the room, while the mutilated human vanished wordlessly into the crowd, cradling the stump of his gun arm and counting himself fortunate. To all appearances, the cantina had returned to its former state, with one small exception. Ben Kenobi was given a respectful amount of space at the bar. Luke barely heard the renewed conversation. He was still shaken by the speed of the fight and by the old man's unimagined abilities. As his mind cleared and he moved to rejoin Kenobi, he could overhear bits and snatches of the talk around him, much of it centered on admiration for the cleanliness and finality of the fight. "You're hurt, Luke," Kenobi observed solicitously. Luke felt of the bruise where the big creature had struck him. He started to say, but old Ben cut him off. As if nothing had happened, he indicated the great hairy mass which was shouldering its way through the crowd toward them. "This is Chewbacca," he explained when the anthropoid had joined them at the bar. "He's first mate on a ship that might suit our needs. He'll take us to her captain owner now." "This way," the Wookiee grunted. At least, it sounded something like that to Luke. In any case, the huge creature's follow-me gesture was unmistakable. They started to wend their way deeper into the bar, the Wookiee parting the crowd like a gravel storm cutting canyonettes. Out in front of the cantina, 3PO paced nervously next to the landspeeder. Apparently unconcerned, R2-D2 was engaged in animated electronic conversation with a bright red R2 unit belonging to another of the cantina's patrons. "What could be taking them so long? They went to hire one ship, not a fleet." Abruptly, 3PO paused, beckoning silently for R2 to be quiet. 2 Imperial troopers had appeared on the scene. They were met by an unkempt human who had emerged almost simultaneously from the depths of the cantina. "I do not like the looks of this," the tall droid murmured. Luke had appropriated someone else's drink from a waiter's tray as they made their way to the rear of the cantina. He gulped at it with the giddy air of one who feels himself under divine protection. That safe he was not, but in the company of Kenobi and the giant Wookiee, he began to feel confident that no one in the bar would assault him with so much as a dirty look. In a rear booth they encountered a sharp-featured young man, perhaps 5 years older than Luke, perhaps a dozen. It was difficult to tell. He displayed the openness of the utterly confident, or the insanely reckless. At their approach, the man sent the humanoid wench, who'd been wriggling on his lap, on her way with a whispered something which left a wide, if inhuman, grin on her face. The Wookiee Chewbacca rumbled something at the man, and he nodded in response, glancing up at the newcomers pleasantly. "You're pretty handy with that saber, old man. Not often does one see that kind of swordplay in this part of the Empire anymore." He downed a prodigious portion of whatever filled his mug. "I'm Han Solo, captain of the Millennium Falcon." Suddenly, he became all business. "Chewie tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system?" "That's right, son, if it's on a fast ship," Kenobi told him. Solo didn't bridle at the "son." "Fast ship? You mean you've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?" Kenobi appeared amused. "Should I?" "It's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 standard time parts," Solo told him indignantly. "I've outrun Imperial starships and Corellian cruisers. I think she's fast enough for you, old man." His outrage subsided rapidly. "What's your cargo?" "Only passengers, myself, the boy, and 2 droids. No questions asked." "No questions." Solo regarded his mug, finally looked up. "Is it local trouble?" "Let's just say we'd like to avoid any Imperial entanglements," Kenobi replied casually. "These days, that can be a real trick. It'll cost you a little extra." He did some mental figuring. "All in all, about 10,000. In advance," he added with a smile. "And no questions asked." Luke gaped at the pilot. 10,000? We could almost buy our own ship for that. Solo shrugged. "Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. In any case, could you fly it?" "You bet I could," Luke shot back, rising. "I'm not such a bad pilot myself. I don't—" Again, the firm hand on his arm. "We haven't that much with us," Kenobi explained, "but we could pay you 2,000 now, plus another 15 when we reach Alderaan." Solo leaned forward uncertainly. 15.
You can really get your hands on that kind of money? I promise it. From the government and Alderaan itself. And the worst, you'll have earned an honest fee. 2,000.
But Solo seemed not to hear the last.
17,000. All right, I'll chance it. You got yourselves a ship. As for avoiding Imperial entanglements, you better twist out of here, or even the Millennium Falcon won't be any help to you. He nodded toward the cantina entrance and added quickly, Docking Bay 94, first thing in the morning. 4 Imperial troopers, their eyes darting rapidly from table to booth to bar, had entered the cantina. There was muttering from among the crowd, but whenever the eyes of one of the heavily armed troopers went hunting for the mutterers, the words died with sullen speed. Moving to the bar, the officer in charge asked the bartender a couple of brief questions. The big man hesitated a moment, then pointed toward a place near the back of the room. As he did so, his eyes widened slightly. Those of the officer were unreadable. The booth he was pointing to was empty.
7. Luke and Ben were securing R2-D2 in the back of the speeder, while 3PO kept a lookout for any additional troops. "If Solo's ship is as fast as his boasting, we should be all right," the old man observed with satisfaction. "But 2,000, and 15 more when we reach Alderaan?" "It's not the 15 that worries me. It's the first 2, Kenobi explained. "I'm afraid you'll have to sell your speeder." Luke let his gaze rove over the land speeder, but the thrill it had once given him was gone. Gone along with other things best not dwelt on. "It's all right," he assured Kenobi listlessly. "I don't think I'll need it again." From their vantage point in another booth, Solo and Chewbacca watched as the Imperials strode through the bar. 2 of them gave the Corellian a lingering glance. Chewbacca growled once, and the 2 soldiers hurried their pace somewhat. Solo grinned sardonically, turning to his partner. "Chewie, this charter could save our necks. 17,000! He shook his head in amazement. "Those 2 must really be desperate. I wonder what they're wanted for. But I agreed. No questions. They're paying enough for it. Let's get going. The Falcon won't check itself out." "Going somewhere, Solo?" The Corellian couldn't identify the voice, coming as it did through an electronic translator, but there was no problem recognizing the speaker or the gun it had stuck in Solo's side. The creature was roughly man-sized and bipedal, but its head was something out of delirium by way of an upset stomach. It had huge, dull-faceted eyes, bulbous on a pea-green face. A ridge of short spines crested the high skull, while nostrils and mouth were contained in a taper-like snout. "As a matter of fact," Solo replied slowly, "I was just on my way to see your boss. You can tell Jabba I got the money I owe him." "That's what you said yesterday, and last week, and the week prior to that. It's too late, Solo. I'm not going back to Jabba with another one of your stories." "But I really got the money this time," Solo protested. "Fine, I'll take it now, please." Solo sat down slowly. Jabba's minions were apt to be cursed with nervous trigger fingers. The alien took the seat across from him, the muzzle of the ugly little pistol never straying from Solo's chest. "I haven't got it here with me. Tell Jabba." "It's too late, I think. Jabba would rather have your ship." "Over my dead body," Solo said unamiably. The alien was not impressed. "If you insist. Will you come outside with me, or must I finish it here?" "I don't think they'd like another killing in here," Solo pointed out. Something which might have been a laugh came from the creature's translator. "They'd hardly notice. Get up, Solo. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You've embarrassed me in front of Jabba with your pious excuses for the last time." "I think you're right." Light and noise filled the little corner of the cantina, and when it had faded, all that remained of the innocuous alien was a smoking, slimy spot on the stone floor. Solo brought his hand in the smoking weapon it held out from beneath the table, drawing bemused stares from several of the cantina's patrons and clucking sounds from its more knowledgeable ones. They had known the creature had committed its fatal mistake in allowing Solo the chance to get his hands under cover. "It'll take a lot more than the likes of you to finish me off. Jabba the Hutt always did skimp when it came to hiring his hands." Leaving the booth, Solo flipped the bartender a handful of coins as he and Chewbacca moved off. "Sorry for the mess. I always was a rotten host." Heavily armed troopers hurried down the narrow alleyway, glowering from time to time at the darkly clad beings who hawked exotic goods from dingy little stalls. Here in Mos Eisley's inner regions, the walls were high and narrow, turning the passageway into a tunnel. No one stared angrily back at them. No one shouted imprecations or mouthed obscenities. These armored figures moved with the authority of the Empire, their sidearms boldly displayed and activated. All around, men, not men, and mechanicals were crouched in waste-littered doorways. Among accumulations of garbage and filth they exchanged information and concluded transactions of dubious legality. A hot wind moaned down the alleyway, and the troopers closed their formation. Their precision and order masked a fear of such claustrophobic quarters. One paused to check a door, only to discover it tightly locked and bolted. A sand-encrusted human shambling nearby visited a half-mad harangue on the trooper. Shrugging inwardly, the soldier gave the crazy human a sour eye before moving on down the alley to join up again with his fellows. As soon as they were well past, the door slid open a crack, and a metallic face peered out. Below Threepio's leg, a squat barrel shape struggled for a view. "I would rather have gone with Master Luke than stay here with you. Still, orders are orders. I don't quite know what all the trouble is about, but I'm sure it must be your fault." R2 responded with a near impossibility, a sniggering beat. "You watch your language," the taller machine warned. The number of old land speeders and other powered transports in the dusty lot, which were still capable of motion, could be counted on the fingers of one hand. But that was not the concern of Luke and Ben as they stood bargaining with the tall, slightly insectoid owner. They were not here to buy, but to sell. None of the passer-by favored the hagglers with so much as a curious glance. Similar transactions, which were the business of no one but the transactors, took place 1,000 times daily in Mos Eisley. Eventually, there were no more pleas or threats to be exchanged. As though doling out vials of his own blood, the owner finalized the sale by passing a number of small metal shapes to Luke. Luke and the insectoid traded formal goodbyes, and then they parted, each convinced he had gotten the better of the deal. "He says it's the best he can do. Since the XP-38 came out, they just aren't in demand anymore," Luke sighed. "Don't look so discouraged," Kenobi chided him. "What you've obtained will be sufficient. I've enough to cover the rest." Leaving the main street, they turned down an alleyway and walked past a small robot herding along a clutch of creatures resembling attenuated anteaters. As they rounded the corner, Luke strained for a forlorn glimpse of the old land speeder, his last link with his former life. Then there was no more time for looking back. Something short and dark that might have been human underneath all its wrappings stepped out of the shadows as they moved around the corner. It continued staring after them as they disappeared down a bend in the walkway. The docking bay entrance to the small saucer-shaped spacecraft was completely ringed by 6 men and aliens, of which the former were by half the most grotesque. A great mobile tub of muscle and suet, topped by a shaggy, scarred skull, surveyed the semicircle of armed assassins with satisfaction. Moving forward from the center of the crescent, he shouted toward the ship. "Come on out, Solo. We got you surrounded." "If so, you're facing the wrong way," came a calm voice. Jabba the Hutt jumped, in itself a remarkable sight. His lackeys likewise whirled, to see Han Solo and Chewbacca standing behind them. "You see, I've been waiting for you, Jabba." "I expected you would be," the Hutt admitted, at once pleased and alarmed by the fact that neither Solo nor the big Wookiee appeared to be armed. "Not the type to run," Solo said. "Run? Run from what?" Jabba countered. The absence of visible weapons bothered Jabba more than he cared to admit to himself. There was something peculiar here, and it would do better to make no hasty moves until he discovered what was amiss. "Han, my boy, there are times when you disappoint me. I merely wish to know why you haven't paid me, as you should have long ago. And why did you have to fry poor Greedo like that, after all you and I have been through together?" Solo grinned tightly. "Shove it, Jabba. There isn't enough sentiment in your body to warm an orphan bacterium. As for Greedo, you sent him to kill me." "Why, Han," Jabba protested in surprise. "Why would I do that? You're the best smuggler in the business. You're too valuable to fry. Greedo was only relaying my natural concern at your delays. He wasn't going to kill you." "I think he thought he was. Next time, don't send one of your hired twerps. If you got something to say, come see me yourself." Jabba shook his head and his jowls shook, lazy, fleshy echoes of his mock sorrow. Han, if only you hadn't had to dump that shipment of spice. You understand. I just can't make an exception. Where would I be if every pilot who smuggled for me dumped his shipment at the first sign of an Imperial warship?"
and then simply showed empty pockets when I demanded recompense. It's not good business. I can be generous and forgiving, but not to the point of bankruptcy. You know, even I get bored sometimes, Jabba. Do you think I dumped the spice because I got tired of its smell? I wanted to deliver it as much as you wanted to receive it. I had no choice. Again, the sardonic smile. As you say, I'm too valuable to fry. But I got it chartered now, and I can pay you back, plus a little extra. I just need some more time. I can give you 1,000 on account, the rest in 3 weeks. The gross form seemed to consider, then directed his next words not to Solo, but to his hirelings. Put your blasters away. His gaze and a predatory smile turned to the wary Corellian. Han, my boy, I'm only doing this because you're the best and I need you again sometime. So, out of the greatness of my soul and a forgiving heart, and for an extra, say, 20%, I'll give you a little more time. The voice nearly cracked with restraint. But this is the last time. If you disappoint me again, if you trample my generosity in your mocking laughter, I'll put a price on your head so large you won't be able to go near a civilized system for the rest of your life, because on every one your name and face will be known to men who will gladly cut your guts out for 1/10 of what I'll promise them. I'm glad we both have my best interests at heart, replied Solo pleasantly, as he and Chewbacca started past the staring eyes of the Hutt's hired guns. Don't worry, Jabba. I'll pay you, but not because you threaten me. I'll pay you because it's my pleasure. They're starting to search the spaceport central, the commander declared, having to alternatively run a couple steps and then walk to keep pace with the long strides of Darth Vader. The Dark Lord was deep in thought as he strode down one of the battle station's main corridors, trailed by several aides. The reports are just starting to come in, the commander went on. It's only a matter of time before we have those droids. Send in more men if you have to. Never mind the protests to the planetary governor. I must have those droids. It's her hope of that data being used against us that it is the pillar of her resistance to the mind probes. I understand, Lord Vader. Until then, we must waste our time with Governor Tarkin's foolish plan to break her. There's Docking Bay 94, Luke told Kenobi and the robots who had rejoined them, and there's Chewbacca. He seems excited about something. Indeed, the big Wookiee was waving over the heads of the crowd and jabbering loudly in their direction. Speeding their pace, none of the foursome noticed the small, dark-clad thing that had followed them from the transporter lot. The creature moved into the doorway and pulled a tiny transmitter from a pouch concealed by its multifold robes. The transmitter looked far too new and modern to be in the grasp of so decrepit a specimen, yet its manipulator was speaking into it with steady assurance. Docking Bay 94, Luke noted, was no different in appearance from a host of other grandiosely named docking bays scattered throughout Mos Eisley. It consisted mostly of an entrance rampway and an enormous pit gouged from the rocky soil. This served as clearance radii for the effects of the simple anti-grav drive, which boosted all spacecraft clear of the gravitational field of the planet. The mathematics of space drive were simple enough, even to Luke. Anti-grav could operate only when there was a sufficient gravity well to push against, like that of a planet, whereas supralight travel could only take place when a ship was clear of that same gravity. Hence the necessity for the dual drive system on any extra system craft. The pit which formed Docking Bay 94 was as shabbily cut and run down as the majority of Mos Eisley. Its sloping sides were crumbled in places, instead of being smoothly fashioned as they were on more populous worlds. Luke felt it formed the perfect setting for the spacecraft Chewbacca was leading them toward. That battered ellipsoid, which could only loosely be labeled a ship, appeared to have been pieced together out of old hull fragments and components discarded as unusable by other craft. The wonder of it, Luke mused, was that the thing actually held its shape. Trying to picture this vehicle space-worthy would have caused him to collapse in hysteria, were the situation not so serious. But to think of traveling to Alderaan in this pathetic— what a piece of junk! He finally murmured, unable to hide his feelings any longer. They were walking up the rampway toward the open port. This thing couldn't possibly make it into hyperspace. Kenobi didn't comment, but merely gestured toward the port where a figure was coming to meet them. Either Solo had supernaturally acute hearing, or else he was used to the reaction the sight of the Millennium Falcon produced in prospective passengers. She may not look like much, he confessed as he approached them, but she's all go. I've added a few unique modifications to her myself. In addition to piloting, I like to tinker. She'll make .5 factors beyond light speed. Luke scratched his head as he tried to reassess the craft in view of its owner's claims. Either the Corellian was the biggest liar this side of the galactic center, or there was more to this vessel than met the eye. Luke thought back once more to old Ben's admission never to trust surface impressions, and decided to reserve judgment on the ship and its pilot until after he had watched them in operation. Chewbacca had lingered behind at the docking bay entrance. Now he rushed up the ramp, a hairy whirlwind, and blabbered excitedly at Solo. The pilot regarded him coolly, nodding from time to time, then barked a brief reply. The Wookiee charged into the ship, pausing only to urge everyone to follow. "We seem to be a bit rushed," Solo explained cryptically, "so if you hurry aboard, we'll be off." Luke was about to venture some questions, but Kenobi was already prodding him up the ramp. The droids followed. Inside, Luke was slightly startled to see the bulky Chewbacca squirm and fight his way into a pilot's chair, which, despite modifications, was still overwhelmed by his massive form. The Wookiee flipped several tiny switches with digits seemingly too big for the task. Those great paws drifted with surprising grace over the controls. A deep throbbing started somewhere within the ship as the engines were activated. Luke and Ben began strapping themselves into the vacant seats in the main passageway. Outside the docking bay entrance, a long, leathery snout protruded from dark folds of cloth, and somewhere in the depths to either side of that imposing proboscis, eyes stared intently. They turned, along with the rest of the head, as a squad of 8 Imperial troops rushed up. Perhaps not surprisingly, they headed straight for the enigmatic figure who whispered something to the lead trooper and gestured to the docking bay. The information must have been provocative. Activating their weapons and raising them in firing position, the troops charged en masse down the docking bay entrance. A glint of light on moving metal caught Solo's eyes as the unwelcome outlines of the first troop showed themselves. Solo thought it unlikely they would pause to engage in casual conversation. His suspicion was confirmed before he could open his mouth to protest their intrusion, as several dropped to their knees and opened fire on him. Solo ducked back inside, turning to yell forward. "Chewie! Deflector shields, quick! Get us out of here!" A throaty roar of acknowledgement came back to him. Drawing his own pistol, Solo managed to snap off a couple of bursts from the comparative safety of the hatchway. Seeing that their quarry was neither helpless nor comatose, the exposed troops dove for cover. The low throbbing rose to a whine, then to a deafening howl, as Solo's hand came down on the quick-release button. Immediately the overhead hatch cover slammed shut. As the retreating troops raced out of the docking bay entrance, the ground was trembling steadily. They ran smack into a second squad, which had just arrived in response to the rapidly spreading emergency call. One of the soldiers, gesticulating wildly, tried to explain to the newly arrived ranking officer what had happened back in the bay. As soon as the panting trooper had finished, the officer whipped out a compact communicator and shouted into it. "Flight deck! They're trying to escape! Send everything you got after this ship!" All across Mos Eisley, alarms began to sound, spreading out from Docking Bay 94 in concentric circles of concern. Several soldiers scouring one alleyway reacted to the citywide alarm at the same time as they saw the small freighter lift gracefully into the clear blue sky above Mos Eisley. It shrank to a pinpoint before any of them thought to bring a weapon to bear. Luke and Ben were already undoing their acceleration straps as Solo walked past them, moving toward the cockpit with the easy, loose-limbed stride of the experienced spacer. Once forward, he fell rather than sat in the pilot's seat and immediately began checking readouts and gauges. In the seat next to him, Chewbacca was growling and grunting like a poorly tuned speeder engine. He turned from studying his own instruments long enough to jab a massive finger at the tracking screen. Solo gave it a quick glance, then turned irritably to his own panel. I know. Looks like 2, maybe 3 destroyers. Somebody certainly dislikes our passengers. Sure picked ourselves a hot one this time. Try to hold them off somehow until I can finish the programming for the super light jump. Angle the deflectors for maximum shielding. With those instructions, he ceased conversing with the huge Wookiee as his hands flew over the computer input terminals. Solo did not even turn around when a small cylindrical shape appeared in the doorway behind him. R2-D2 beeped a few remarks, then scurried away. Rear scanners showed the baleful lemon eye of Tatooine shrinking rapidly behind them. It wasn't rapid enough to eliminate the 3 points of light that indicated the presence of the pursuing Imperial warships. Although Solo had ignored R2, he turned to acknowledge the entrance of his human passengers. "We've got 2 more coming in from different angles," he told them, scrutinizing the remorseless instrumentation. "They're going to try to box us up before we can jump. 5 ships. What did you two do to attract this kind of company?" Can't you outrun them? Luke asked sarcastically, ignoring the pilot's question. I thought you said this thing was fast. Watch your mouth, kid, or you'll find yourself floating home. There's too many of 'em, for one thing, but we'll be safe enough once we made the jump into hyperspace. He grinned knowingly. Can't nobody track another ship accurately at super light speeds. Plus, I know a few tricks that ought to lose any persistent stick tights. I wish I'd known you boys were so popular. Why? Luke asked challengingly. Would you have refused to take us? Not necessarily, the Corellian replied, refusing to be baited. But I sure as hell would have boosted your fare. Luke had a retort poised on his lips. It was wiped out as he threw up his arms to ward off a brilliant red flash, which gave black space outside the viewport the temporary aspect of the surface of a sun. Kenobi, Solo, and even Chewbacca did likewise, since the proximity of the explosion nearly overrode the phototropic shielding. Here's where the situation gets interesting, Solo muttered. How long before you can make the jump? Kenobi inquired easily, apparently unconcerned that at any second they might all cease to exist. We're still within the gravitational influence of Tatooine, came the cool response. It'll be a few minutes yet before the navigation computer can compensate and effect an accurate jump. I could override its decision, but the hyperdrive would likely shred itself. That would give me a nice hold full of scrap metal in addition to you four. A few minutes, Luke blurted, staring at the screens. At the rate they're gaining. Traveling through hyperspace isn't like dusting crops, boy. Ever tried calculating a hyperspace jump? Luke had to shake his head. It's no mean trick. Be nice if we rushed it and passed right through a star or some other friendly spatial phenomenon, like a black hole. That would end our trip real quick. Fresh explosions continued to flare close by despite Chewbacca's best efforts at evasion. On Solo's console, a red warning light began to flash for attention. What's that? Luke wondered nervously. We're losing a deflector shield, Solo informed him with the air of a man about to have a tooth pulled. Better strap yourselves back in. We're almost ready to make the jump. It could get bad if we need to take a near burst at the wrong moment. Back in the main hold area, 3PO was already locked tightly into his seat by metal arms stronger than any acceleration straps. R2 swayed back and forth under the concussion produced by increasingly powerful energy bursts against the ship's reflectors. Was this trip really necessary? The tall robot muttered in desperation. I'd forgotten how much I hate space travel. He broke off as Luke and Ben appeared and began strapping themselves back into their chairs. Oddly, Luke was thinking of a dog he had once owned when an immensely powerful something wrenched at the ship's hull with the strength of a fallen angel. Admiral Mahdi entered the quiet conference room, his face streaked by the linear lights lining the walls. His gaze went to the spot where Governor Tarkin stood before the curved view screen, and he bowed slightly. Despite the evidence of the small green gem of a world into the screen, he formally announced, "We have entered the Alderaan system. We await your order." The door signaled, and Tarkin made a falsely gentle gesture to the Admiral. "Wait a moment yet, Mahdi." The door slid aside, and Leia Organa entered, flanked by 2 armed guards, followed by Darth Vader. "I am," Tarkin began. "I know who you are," she spat. "Governor Tarkin. I should have expected to find you holding Vader's leash. I thought I recognized your unique stench when I was first brought on board." "Charming to the last," Tarkin declared in a fashion which suggested he was anything but charmed. "You don't know how hard I found it to sign the order for your termination." His expression changed to one of mock sorrow. "Of course, had you cooperated in our investigation, things might be otherwise. Lord Vader has informed me that your resistance were traditional methods of inquiry." "Torture, you mean?" she countered a trifle shakily. "Let us not bandy semantics," Tarkin smiled. "I'm surprised you had the courage to take the responsibility for issuing the order on yourself." Tarkin sighed reluctantly. "I'm a dedicated man, and the pleasures I reserve for myself are few. One of them is that before your execution I should like you to be my guests at a small ceremony. It will certainly certify this battle station's operational status while at the same time ushering in a new era of Imperial technical supremacy. This station is the final link in the new forged Imperial chain which will bind the million systems of the Galactic Empire together once and for all. Your petty alliance will no longer be of any concern to us. After today's demonstration, no one will dare to oppose Imperial decree, not even the Senate." Organa looked at him with contempt.
Force will not keep the Empire together. Force has never kept anything together for very long. The more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip through your fingers. You're a foolish man, Governor. Foolish men often choke to death on their own delusions." Tarkin smiled a death's head smile, his face a parchment skulls. "It will be interesting to see what manner of passing Lord Vader has in mind for you. I am certain it will be worthy of you, and of him. But before you leave us, we must demonstrate the power of the station once and for all, in a conclusive fashion. In a way, you have determined the choice of subject for this demonstration. Since you have proven reluctant to supply us with the location of the rebel stronghold, I have deemed it appropriate to select as an alternate subject your home planet of Alderaan." "No! You can't! Alderaan's a peaceful world, with no standing armies. You can't!" Tarkin's eyes gleamed. "You would prefer another target? A military target, perhaps? We're agreeable. Name the system." He shrugged elaborately. "I grow tired of such games. For the last time, where is the main rebel base?" A voice announced over a hidden speaker that they had approached within anti-grav range of Alderaan, approximately 6 planetary diameters. That was enough to accomplish what all of Vader's infernal devices had failed to. "Dantooine," she whispered, staring at the deck, all pretense of defiance gone now. "They're on Dantooine." Tarkin let out a slow sigh of satisfaction, then turned to the black figure nearby. "There, you see, Lord Vader, she can be reasonable. One needs only frame the question properly to elicit the desired response." He directed his attention to the other officers. "After concluding our little test here, we shall make haste to move on to Dantooine. You may proceed with the operation, gentlemen." It took several seconds for Tarkin's words, so casually uttered, to penetrate. "What?" Organa finally gasped. "Dantooine," Tarkin explained, examining his fingers, "is too far from the centers of Imperial population to serve as the subject of an effective demonstration. You will understand that for reports of our power to spread rapidly through the Empire, we require an obstreperous world more centrally located. Have no fear, though. We will deal with your rebel friends in Dantooine as soon as possible." "But you said—" Organa started to protest. "The only words which have meaning are the last ones spoken," Tarkin declared cuttingly. "We will proceed with the destruction of Alderaan as planned. Then you will enjoy watching with us as we obliterate the Dantooine center of this stupid and futile rebellion." He gestured to the 2 soldiers flanking her. "Escort her to the principal observation level and," he smiled, "make certain she is provided with an unobstructed view."